Bessie Smith, of course, the Empress of the Blues, singing of a disaster, of a flood. Sitting with me, hearing Bessie Smith on this recording, is James Baldwin, brilliant young American writer, but perhaps a more specific description of Mr. Baldwin, since he is one of the rare men in the world who seems to know who he is today. James Baldwin, brilliant young Negro American writer. And as you listen to this, Jim, to this record of Bessie Smith, what's your feeling?
It's very hard to describe that feeling. The first time I ever heard this record was in Europe, and under very different circumstances than I'd ever listened to Bessie in New York. And what struck me was the fact that she was singing, as you say, about a disaster, which had almost killed her, and she'd accepted it, and was going beyond it. It's a fantastic kind of understatement in it. It's the way I want to write. You know, when she says, "My house fell down and I can't live there no more," it's a great sentence. It's a great achievement.
The way you want to write, you say.
Yeah.
I'm looking now at page 5 of your new book, and it's a remarkable one. Nobody Knows My Name. It's a series of essays, articles, opinions of James Baldwin, more notes of a native son, the subtitle. And on page 5, the reason I'd chosen the Bessie Smith record, because on page 5 you write of your being in Europe, you're in Switzerland.
Yes.
And you said you came armed with 2 Bessie Smith records and a typewriter. And I began to try to recreate the life that I had first known as a child, from which I'd spent so many years in flight. And it was Bessie Smith who, through her tone and her cadence, helped me dig back to the way I myself must have spoken when I was little. And I remember the things I had heard and seen and felt. I buried them deep. And here's the part, I had never listened to Bessie Smith in America. In the same way for years I never touched watermelon. But in Europe, she helped me reconcile myself.
Yes, well, how can I put that? That winter in Switzerland, I was working on my first novel, which I thought I would never be able to finish. And I finally realized in Europe that one of the reasons that I couldn't finish this novel was because I was ashamed of where I'd come from and where I'd been, and ashamed of the life in the church, and ashamed of my father, ashamed of the blues, and ashamed of jazz, and of course ashamed of watermelon, because it was, all of these stereotypes that the country inflicts on Negroes, that we all eat watermelon, or we all do nothing but sing the blues and all that. Well, I was afraid of all that, and I ran from it. And when I say I was trying to dig back to the way I myself must have spoken when I was little, I realized that I had acquired so many affectations, I had told myself so many lies, that I really had buried myself beneath a whole fantastic image of myself which wasn't mine, but white people's image of me. And I realized that I had not always talked, obviously I hadn't always talked the way I had forced myself to learn how to talk. And I had to find out what I had been like in the beginning. In order, just technically then, to recreate Negro speech, I realized it was a cadence, it was a beat, much more than, it was not a question of dropping S's or N's or G's, but a question of the beat, really. And Bessie had the beat, And in that, this icy wilderness, as far removed from Harlem as anything you can imagine, with Bessie Smith and me, I began
And white snow.
And white snow, and white mountains, and white faces, who really thought I had been sent by the devil. It was very strange. They'd never seen a Negro before. And in this kind of isolation, it's very hard to describe, I managed to finish the book. And I played Bessie every day. And really, literally, this may sound strange. A lot of the book is in dialogue, and I corrected things according to what I was able to hear when Bessie sang, and when James P. Johnson plays. It's that tone and that sound, which is in me.
This is in a forthcoming novel.
This is in a forthcoming novel. Yes.
The point you made a moment ago, the point you were speaking of, the sense of shame. Did you sense this, the sense of shame of a heritage that is so rich in accepting the white man's stereotype of yourself? I'm
afraid it's one of the great dilemmas, one of the great psychological hazards of being an American Negro. And in fact, it's much more than that. I've seen a great many people go under. And every Negro in America is, some way, one way or another, menaced by it. One's born in a white country, in a white Protestant Puritan country, where one was once a slave, where all the standards and all the images that when you open your eyes in the world, everything you see, none of it applies to you. You go to white movies and like everybody else, you fall in love with Joan Crawford, and you root for the good guys who are killing off the Indians. And it comes as a great psychological collision when you begin to realize that all of these things are really metaphors for your oppression and will lead into a kind of psychological warfare in which you may perish. I was born in a church, for example, and my father was a very rigid and righteous man. But of course, we were in Harlem. We lived in a terrible house. And downstairs from us, there were, all these, what my father called good time people. There was a prostitute and all of her paramours and all that jazz. I remember I loved this woman. She was very nice to us. But we weren't allowed to go to her house. And whenever we went there, we were beaten for it. And when I was older, that whole odor of gin, homemade gin, really, and pig's feet and chitterlings and poverty and abasement, all of this got terribly mixed up together in my mind with the whole holy roller white god business. And I really began to go a little out of my mind because I obviously wasn't white. It wasn't even a question so much of wanting to be white, but I didn't quite know anymore what being black meant. I couldn't accept what I'd been told, and all you ever told in this country about being black is that it's a terrible, terrible thing to be. Now, in order to survive this, you have to really dig down into yourself and recreate yourself, really, according to no image which yet exists in America. You have to impose, in fact, this may sound very strange, you have to decide who you are, and force the world to deal with you and not with this idea of you.
You have to decide who you are, whether you are black or white, who you are.
Who you are. And then I must say at this point, at that pressure, the question of being black or white is robbed of its power. I mean, you can still, of course, be beaten up on the South Side by anybody, I mean, the social menace does not lessen. But in some way, it is a world now which perhaps can destroy you physically. But the danger of your destroying yourself has not vanished, but is minimized.
The name of the book, if we may, this is directly connected. Nobody Knows My Name. For years, when I speak of you, someone known as James, never known as James Baldwin, like Home James, sometimes called George in the old days, Sam, or
Boy.
Sometimes Boy.
Sometimes.
Nobody Knows My Name. Why did you choose that title?
Well, at the risk of sounding pontifical, it's at once, I suppose, a fairly bitter title, but it's also meant as a kind of warning to my country. In the days when people call me boy, those days haven't passed, except that I didn't answer then, and I don't answer now. To be a Negro in this country is really just, as Ralph Ellison has said it very well, really never to be looked at. And what white people see when they look at you is not
invisible.
You're invisible. What they do see when they look at you is what they've invested you with. And what they've invested you with is all the agony and the pain and the danger and the passion and the torment, sin, death, and hell, of which everyone in this country is terrified. You represent a level of experience which Americans deny. And I think, this may sound mystical, but I think it's very easily proven. It's proven in great relief in the South when you consider the extraordinary price, the absolutely prohibitive price the South has paid to keep the Negro in his place. And I've not succeeded in doing that, but I have succeeded in having what is almost certainly the most bewildered and demoralized white population, in the Western world. And at another level, you can see in the life of the country, not only in the South, what a terrible price the country has paid for this effort to keep a distance between themselves and black people. It was in the same way, for example, that it is very difficult, it is hazardous, psychologically, personally hazardous for a Negro in this country really to hate white people because he is too involved with them, not only socially but historically, and no matter who says what, in fact, Negroes and whites in this country are related to each other. Half of the black families in the South are related to the judges and the lawyers and the white families of the South. They're cousins and kissing cousins at least kissing cousins. Now this is a terrible depth of involvement. It's easy for an African, to hate the invader and drive him out of Africa. But it is very difficult for an American Negro to do this obviously cannot do this with white people. There's no place to drive them. This is the country which belongs equally to us both. And one's got to learn to live together here, or else there won't be any country.
This matter of living together, or this ambivalent attitude that the South has toward the Negro, and the ambivalence perhaps is most eloquently and perhaps tragically expressed in the life, the sayings of William Faulkner, the brilliant American novelist who writes a remarkable story, Dry September, in which seems to analyze the malaise. At the same time, he himself makes comments that are shocking. You have a chapter in your book dealing with Faulkner and desegregation. And is it this ambivalence, too, that
it's this love, hatred. I hate to think of what the spiritual state of the South would be if all the Negroes moved out of it. The white people there don't want them, want to keep them there, want them in their place, but would be terrified if they left. I really think the bottom of their world would have fallen out. In the case of Faulkner, in Dry September or in Light in August, or even in The Sound of the Fury, he can really get at, as you put it, to the bone. He can get at the truth of what the black-white relation is in the South and what a dark force it is in the Southern personality. But at the same time, Faulkner as a citizen, as a citizen of Mississippi, is committed to what Mississippians take to be their past. And it's one thing for Faulkner to deal with the Negro in his imagination, where he can control him, and quite another for him to deal with him in life, where he can't control him. And in life, obviously, the Negro, the uncontrollable Negro, is determined to overthrow everything in which Faulkner imagines himself to believe. It's one thing to demand justice in literature, and another thing to face the price that one's got to pay for it in life. And I think another thing about the Southerners, and I think it's also true of the nation, is that no matter how they deny it or what kind of rationalizations they cover it up with, they know the crimes they've committed against black people, and they're terrified that these crimes will be committed against them.
The element of guilt then is here too.
Yes.
There's a point you make, and very beautifully, somewhere in the book, and Nobody Knows My Name, I forget which one of the essays involved. In the South, the white man is continuously bringing up the matter of the Negro. In the North, never.
Yes, in the North.
Ignored, so obsessed in one case and so ignored
in another.
In the other.
It's very funny. It's very funny, especially because the results turn out to be in the case of the Negroes a lot in the world, so very much the same. But it seems to me that it must be absolute torment to be a Southerner if you imagine that these people, that one day, one day even Faulkner himself was born, and certainly, when he was born, he was raised by a black woman, probably the model for Dilsey, and one fine day, a child of 3 or 4 or 5 who has been involved with black people on the most intense level, at the most important time in anybody's life, suddenly it breaks on him like a thundercloud that it's all taboo. And of course, since we know that nobody ever recovers really, from his earliest impressions, the torment that goes on in a Southerner who is absolutely forbidden, to excavate his beginnings, it seems to me is the key to those terrifying mobs. It isn't hatred that drives those people in the streets; it's pure terror.
And perhaps a bit of schizophrenia here,
Well,
too.
by this time, it's absolutely schizophrenic. And I must say, not only in the South, but the South is a very useful example on a personal and social level of what is occurring really in the country, And the sexual paranoia, again, it's very important to remember what it means to be born in a Protestant Puritan country with all the taboos which are placed on the flesh, and to have at the same time in this country such a vivid example of, at least in the imagination, of paganism and the sexual liberty with which white people invest Negroes, and penalize them for.
The very nature of the American heritage, you seem to be just digging into right now, the combination of Puritanism and paganism both.
Yes,
and
yes.
the conflict.
And the
how this
terrible
affects
tension.
the-
The terrible
and the
tension.
tensions that come as a result.
It's a guilt about the flesh, and in this country, the Negro pays for that guilt that white people have about the flesh.
Since you bring up this point of the Negro pays for the guilt the white people have about flesh, we think too of the position, the relative position of the Negro woman and the Negro man.
My God.
And in this article, you wrote a beautiful article for Tone magazine. You were saying something about the mistress of the house, the white mistress, who admires her maid very much, but she speaks of the no-count
The
husband.
no-count husband.
What it means to be a Negro male.
It connects with that old phrase that Negroes are the last to be hired and the first to be fired. And this does not apply to the Negro maid particularly, though it can, but it absolutely applies without exception and with great rigor to Negro men. And one's got to consider, especially when one begins to talk about this whole theory, the whole tension between violence and nonviolence, the dilemma and the rage and the anguish of a Negro man who in the first place is forced to accept all kinds of humiliations in his working day, whose power in the world is so slight that he can not really protect his home, his wife, his children, and then finds himself out of work and watches his children growing up menaced in exactly the same way that he has been menaced. When a child is 14, when a Negro child is 14, he knows the score already. And there's nothing you can do, and all you can do about it is pray, really, that this will not destroy him. But the tension that this creates within the breast of the man is absolutely unimaginable, and something this country refuses to imagine, and very, very dangerous. And it complicates the sexuality of the country and of the Negro in a hideous way, exactly because all Negroes are raised in a kind of matriarchy, since after all the wife can go out and wash the white lady's clothes, and steal little things from the kitchen, and this is the way we've all grown up. Now, this creates another social psychological problem in what we like to refer to as a subculture, which is a part of the bill that the country is going to have to pay. Bills always do come in. One's always got to pay.
There's always, as a phrase Sandberg used, slums always seek their revenge. Another way of saying it, too.
Yes, they do indeed.
Thinking about the matriarchal setup of the Negro family, the Negro life, even back to slave days, the Underground Railway leaders, Harriet Tubman, were the women.
Yeah. It's a terrible thing. Negro women for generations have raised white children who sometimes lynched their children, and have tried to raise their raise their child like a man, and yet in the full knowledge that if he really walks around like a man, he's going to be cut down. It's a terrible kind of dilemma. It's a terrible price to ask anybody to pay, and in this country, Negro women have been paying it for 300 years, and for 100 of those years when they were legally and technically free. When people talk about time, therefore, I can't help but be absolutely not only impatient but bewildered. Why should I wait any longer? And in any case, even if I were willing to, which I'm not, how?
The point you mean about go slow.
Go slow, yes.
Go slow, take it easy. Again, there's a last sentence you have on that, on the Faulkner chapter about how it changed, about whatever approach to humanity, to being human beings, it must be now, the moment you speak
It's
of.
Always now.
The world we're living in, we have to make it over. The world we live, we made the world we live, but you speak of now. It's always now.
Time is always now. Everybody, and I think everybody who's ever thought about his own life knows this. You don't make resolutions about something you're going to do next year. If you decide to write a book, you may write the book may be finished 20 years from now, but you've got to start it now.
I'm thinking of the subtitle of your book now and the position of the Negro woman, Negro man. Notes of a Native Son. Naturally, I immediately think of Richard Wright, who has meant so much to you as an artist and as a man. And his short story, you refer to this beautifully here in the chapter, Alas, Poor Richard, one of the three chapters on Richard Wright, Man of All Work, in which the husband, to get a job, dresses himself up in his wife's clothes and hires herself as a cook.
Yeah. It's a beautiful, terrifying story. And it really gets at something which has been hidden for all these generations, which is the ways in which it really suggests, more forcibly than anything I've ever read, really, the humiliation that a Negro male endures. And it's this which the country doesn't want to know. And therefore, when people talk about the noble savage, and the greater sexuality of Negroes and all that jazz, Whereas I could name, if we were not on the air, 6 people, whom I grew up, 6 men who were on the needle, just because there is really the demoralization is so complete that in order to make the act of love, there's got to be a certain confidence, a certain trust. Otherwise, it degenerates into nothing but desperate, and futureless brutality.
You've spoken of the needle now, and we think, of course, of junkies, and we think
Yes.
of narcotics. And here again, perhaps for some, the only means of escape from the brutal reality.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I knew a boy very well once who told me, almost that many words, that he wasn't trying to get high. He was just trying to hold himself together. Because he also said, talking about himself walking through one of our cities one morning, and the way people looked at him, and he said to himself, he told me that, well, if you ought to be able to bear me if I can bear you. No. What is most appalling about it is that all of these things might not be so terrible if, when facing well-meaning white people, one didn't realize that they don't know anything about this at all, and don't want to know. And this somehow really is the last drop in a very bitter cup. Because if they don't know and don't want to know, then what hope is there? When people talk to me about, the strides that have been made and the all these dreary movies Hollywood keeps turning about be kind to Negroes today, and isn't this a good sign? Well, of course, they've never seen these movies with a Negro audience watching them,
What is the reaction?
Well, for example, in The Defiant Ones, a movie which I really cannot say anything.
That's okay. Go ahead. Please do.
At the end of that movie, when Sidney, who was very brilliant in it, and who does his best with a rather dreary role, does something with it which I wouldn't believe could have been done. Anyway, at the end of that movie, when Sidney jumps off the train to rescue Tony Curtis, downtown, I saw it twice deliberately. I saw it downtown and for a white liberal audience. I suppose they were liberal. There was a great sigh of relief and clapping, and I felt that this was a very noble gesture on the part of a very noble black man. And I suppose in a way it was. And I saw it uptown. And then he jumps off the train, and there's a tremendous roar of fury from the audience, with which I must say I agreed. They told Sidney to get back on the train, you fool. And in any case, why in the world would he go back to the chain gang where they're obviously going to be separated again? It's still a Jim Crow chain gang. What's the movie supposed to prove? And what the movie is designed to prove, really, to white people, is that Negroes are going to forgive them for their crimes, and that somehow they're going to escape scot-free. Now, I myself am not, I'm not being vengeful when I say this at all, because I would hate to see the nightmare begin all over again with shoes on the other foot. But I'm talking about a human fact, and the human fact is this: that one can't escape anything one's done. One's got to pay for it. And you either pay for it willingly or you pay for it unwillingly.
And I was thinking of the Negro audience, and I get back on the train, you fool. We think of 2 movements happening simultaneously with the Negro in America today: the Black Muslim movement and Martin Luther King.
Yes.
And here it seems to be directly connected, doesn't it?
Yes, precisely. And I must admit, that there is a great ambivalence in myself about, for example, I'm devoted to King, and I work with CORE, and try to help raise money for the Freedom Riders, and I adore those children. I have tremendous respect for them. And yet, at the same time, and talking to very different people, and somewhat older, and also talking to ex-sit-in students who said, no, I simply can't take it anymore. I don't know. Let me put it another way. King's influence in the South is tremendous, but his influence in the North is slight. And the North loves to talk about the South. Chicago wants to talk about Mississippi, as though they had no South Side. And, and white people in New York talk about Alabama as though they had no Harlem. And it's a great device on the part of white people to ignore what's happening in their own backyard. Now, whether, let us say, I were for or against violence, this is absolutely irrelevant. The question which really obsesses me today is that whether or not I like it, and whether or not you like it, unless the situation is ameliorated, and very, very quickly, there will be violence. There will be violence. I'm as convinced of this as I am that I'm sitting in this chair one day in Birmingham. And it won't be the fault of the Negroes in Birmingham. It's the fault of the administration of Birmingham and the apathy of Washington. It is an intolerable situation. It has been intolerable for 100 years. I really cannot tell my nephew or my brother. My nephew is 14. My brother's a grown man. I can't really tell my nephew that if someone hits him, he shouldn't hit back. I really cannot tell him that. And still less can I tell my brother that if someone comes to his house with a gun, that you should let him in, and allow him to do what he wants with his children and his wife. But the point is, even if I were able to tell my brother that he should, there's absolutely no guarantee that my brother will, and I can't blame him. It's too easy in another way for the country to sit in admiration before the sit-in students, because it doesn't cost them anything. They have no idea what it costs those kids to go through that, to picket a building, for example, when people upstairs in the building are spitting down on your head or trying to vomit down on you. This is a tremendous amount to demand of people who are technically free in a free country which is supposed to be the leader of the West. It seems to me a great cowardice in the part of the Republic to expect that it's going to be saved by a handful of children for whom they refuse to be responsible.
And so it is so much more difficult then, or so much more easy, I should say, for a black Muslim speaker to win followers than for Martin Luther King, who was asking.
It is
so
always much easier, obviously, to how can I put this? Well, in Harlem, those meetings every Saturday night, those people are there listening to those speeches and all kinds of other speeches, because they are in despair, and they don't believe. And this is the most dangerous thing that has happened. They don't believe. They've been betrayed so often and by so many people, not all of them white. They don't believe that the country really means what it says, and there is nothing in the record to indicate that the country means what it says. Now, when they are told that they are better than white people, it is a perfectly inevitable development. If, for all these hundreds of years, white people are going around saying they're better than anybody else, sooner or later, they were bound to create a counterweight to this, especially with Africa on the stage of the world now, which is simply to take the whole legend of Western history and its whole entire theology, changing one or two pronouns, and transferring from Jerusalem to Islam, and this is just this small change and turn it all against the white world. And the white world can't do anything about this, can't call the Muslim leaders or anybody else on this until they're willing to face their own history.
How does all this then connect with a Negro artist, a Negro writer, specifically you, coming out and to a man who meant so much to you, Richard Wright? There's, in one of the, again, we come back to Wright's chapter, he escaped. He spoke of Paris as a refuge, but you looked upon it as a sort of way station for yourself.
Well, in the beginning, I must admit, I looked on Paris as a refuge, too. I never intended to come back to this country. I lived there so long, though, and I got to know a great deal about Paris. And I suppose that several things happened to me. One of them was watching American Negroes there who had dragged Mississippi, so to speak, across the ocean with them, and were operating now in a vacuum. I myself, carried all my social habits to Paris with me, where they were not needed, but where it took me a long time to learn how to do without them. And this complex frightened me very much. But more important than that, perhaps, was my relationship with Africans and with Algerians there, who belonged to France and didn't demand any spectacular degree of perception to realize that I was treated, insofar as I was noticed at all, differently from them because I had an American passport. I may not have liked this fact, but it was a fact. And I could see very well that if I were an Algerian, I would not have been living in the same city in which I imagined myself to be living as Jimmy Baldwin, or if I were an African, it would have been a very different city for me. And I also began to see that the West, the entire West, was changing, was breaking up, that its power over me, over Africans, was gone and would never come again. So then it seemed that exile was but another way of being in limbo. But I suppose finally the most important thing was that I am a writer, and that sounds grandiloquent, but the truth is that I don't think that, seriously speaking, really, that anybody in his right mind would want to be a writer. But you do discover that you are one, and then you haven't got any choice. Either you live that life or you won't live any. And I'm an American writer. This country is my subject. And in working out the forthcoming novel, I began to realize that the New York I was trying to describe was a New York which was by this time nearly 20 years old. And I had to come back to check my impressions and to, as it turned out, be stung again, to look at it again, bear it again, and to be reconciled to it again. Now, I imagine in my own case that I will have to spend the rest of my life, however long that will be, as a kind of transatlantic commuter. Because at some point when I'm in this country, I always get to a place where I realize that I don't see it very clearly anymore, because it's very exhausting to spend, after all, and you do spend 24 hours a day resisting and resenting it, and trying to keep a kind of equilibrium in it. So that I suppose that I'll keep going away and coming back,
You feel your years in Europe afforded you more of a perspective?
Yeah, I began to see this country for the first time. If I hadn't gone away, I would never have been able to see it. And if I had been able to see it, I would never have been able to forgive it. I'm not mad at this country anymore. I'm very worried about it. I'm not worried about the Negroes in the country even so much as I'm worried about the country. The country doesn't know what it's done to Negroes, but the country has no notion whatever, and this is disastrous, of what it's done to itself. They have yet to assess the price they paid, North and South, for keeping the Negro in his place. And from my point of view, it shows on every single level of our lives, from the most public.
Could you expand on this a bit, Jim, what the country has done to itself?
Well, one of the reasons, for example, I think that our youth is so badly educated, and it is inconceivably badly educated, is because education demands a certain daring, a certain independence of mind. You have to teach young people to think. And you have to teach young people, in order to teach young people to think, you have to teach them to think about everything. There mustn't be something they cannot think about. If there's one thing they can't think about, then very shortly they can't think about anything. Now, there's always something in this country, of course, one cannot think about. What one cannot think about is a Negro. Now this may seem like a very subtle argument, but I don't think so. I think that really time will prove the connection between the level, of the lives we lead, and this extraordinary endeavor to avoid black men. And I think it shows in our public life. I think that when I was living in Europe, it occurred to me that what Americans in Europe did not know about Europeans was precisely what they didn't know about me. And what Americans today don't know about the rest of the world, like Cuba or Africa, is what they don't know about me. And the totally incoherent foreign policy of this country is a reflection of the incoherence of the private lives here.
So we don't even know our own names.
No, we don't. That's the whole point. And I suggest this, that in order to learn your name, you're going to have to learn mine. In a way, the key to this country, the American Negro, is the key figure in this country. And if we don't face him, we will never face anything.
Since you've mentioned, I don't know your name, I, a white man, will never know mine. I'm thinking now as a country. When you know the country, we think of Africa immediately. Mm-hmm. And you have, again, returning to your work. And by the way, may I suggest this work to listeners? James Baldwin's Nobody Knows My Name, published by Dial. And even though I say it's a collection of essays, it isn't that. It is a novel. It is an autobiography, really, in a way. It's an autobiography.
Yeah.
You have a journalistic report, and a very accurate and astute one. Princes and Powers, it's called.
Yeah.
You were covering a meeting of Negro writers of the world in
Yes.
Paris.
Yeah.
And African writers were speaking too, as well as writers of...
It was really an African conference. It was predominantly African. the Negroes were there as Africans, or as, well, the black people of the world, let's put it that way.
What of the African writer then? You mentioned Tituola here, and others. Isn't there a problem here? The uncovering of this rich heritage so long buried
Yeah.
by kidnappers, by colonial people, and at the same time we know that technological advances are taking place, changes, slums are being
the 20th
cleared.
century, in fact.
20th century. Now, isn't there loss as well as gain here? How it's a question of things are happening at the same time.
It's a very great question. I don't know what. It's almost impossible to assess what was lost, which makes it impossible to assess what's gained. How can I put this? Yeah, in a way, I almost envy African writers because there's so much to excavate, you know, and because their relationship to the world, at least from my vantage point, about this I may be wrong, seems much more direct than mine can ever be. But God knows, you know, the colonial experience destroyed so much, blasted so much, and of course changed forever the African personality. So one doesn't know what really was there on the other side of the flood. You know, it will take generations before that past can be reestablished, you know, and in effect used. And at the same time, of course, all the African nations are under the obligation, the necessity of moving into the 20th century at really, you know, some fantastic rate of speed, because it's the only way they can survive. And of course, all Africans, whether they know it or not, have endured the European experience and have been stained and, you know, and changed by the European standards. In a curious way, the unification of Africa, insofar as it can be said to exist, is a white invention. That is to say, the only thing that really unites, as far as I can tell, all black men everywhere, is the fact that white men are on their necks. What I'm curious about is what will happen when this is no longer true, and for the first time in the memory of anybody living, black men have their destinies in their own hands. What will come out then, and what the problems and tensions and terrors will be then, is a very great, very loaded question. I think that if we were more honest here, we could do a great deal to aid in this transition, because we have an advantage, which we still consider to be a disadvantage, over all the other Western nations. That is to say, we have created, forgetting, you know, quite apart from everything else, the fact is we have created, and no other nation has, a black man who is part of the West. Now, and in distinction to Belgium or any other European power, we had our slaves on the mainland, and therefore, no matter how we deny it, couldn't avoid a human involvement with them, which we've almost perished denying, but which is nevertheless there. Now, if we could turn about and face this, we would have a tremendous advantage in the world today. But as long as we don't, there isn't much hope for the West, really. How can I put this? If one could accept the fact that it is no longer important to be white, it would begin to cease to be important to be black. If we could accept the fact that no nation with 20 million people, 20 million black people in it, for so long, and with such a depth of involvement, no nation in the least circumstances can really be called a white nation. This would be a great achievement, and it would change a great many things.
This raises a very interesting point. This is all conjecture, of course, assuming that sanity is maintained, assuming that humanity itself, the humanity with all of us, will triumph. A point is, right, just you say this, there will be no white nation and no black nation, but the nations of people. Now we come to a question of this long-buried heritage. At the beginning a Bessie Smith record was played, you once upon a time, not knowing who you were ashamed of it. Now
yes,
realize there's a great pride here in artistry.
Yeah.
Thinking now of the young African. Again,
Yeah.
if a certain identity, and this is an imposed identity from the outside, is lost, will he reject that which was uniquely his for a grayness, perhaps, even though it be more materially advanced?
I have a tendency to doubt it, but then, of course, there's no way of knowing. I have a tendency to, judging only from my very limited experience in Paris with a few Africans, after all, my tendency is to doubt it. I think that the real impulse is to excavate that heritage at no matter what cost and bring it into the present. And I think that this is a very sound idea because I think it's needed. You know, I think that that all the things that were destroyed by Europe, which will never really be put in place again, still in that rubble, I think there's something of very great value, not only for Africans, but for all of us. I really think that we are living in a moment which is as important as that moment when Constantine became a Christian. I think that all the standards by which the Western world has lived so long are in the process of breakdown and a revision, and a kind of passion and a kind of beauty and a kind of joy which was in the world before and has been buried so long has got to come back.
The passion and beauty and joy once in the world has been buried. Now we come to the matter of dehumanization, don't we?
Yes, exactly.
The impersonality of our time.
Yes. And obviously this cannot, well, I would hate to see it continue. I don't ever intend to make my peace with such a world. There's something much more important than Cadillacs, Frigidaires, and IBM machines. And precisely one of the things wrong with this country is this notion that IBM machines and Cadillacs prove something. People are always telling me how many Negroes bought Cadillacs last year. And it terrifies me. I always wonder, is this what you think the country is for? And do you think this is really what I came here and suffered and died for? A lousy Cadillac?
Whether for white or black, is this what our country is for?
For white or black, yes, exactly. I think the country's got to find out what it means by freedom. Freedom is a very dangerous thing. Anything else is disastrous. But freedom is dangerous. You've got to make choices. You've got to make very dangerous choices. You've got to be taught that, your life is in your hands.
The matter of freedom, this leads to another chapter in your book dealing with your meeting with Ingmar Bergman, whom you described as a relatively free artist.
Yeah.
Would you mind telling us a bit about that and what you meant by that?
Well, part of his freedom, of course, is just purely economical. It's based on the social structure, the economic structure of Sweden. That is to say, he hasn't got to worry about the money for his films, which is a very healthy thing for him. But on another level, he impressed me as being free because he had, and this is a great paradox, seems to me, about freedom. He had accepted his limitations, the limitations within himself and the limitations within his society. I don't mean that he necessarily accepted all these limitations. I mean that he was passive in the face of them. But he recognized that he was Ingmar Bergman, who could do some things, therefore could not do some others. It was not going to live forever, Had recognized what people in this country have a great deal of trouble recognizing, that life is very difficult for anybody born. Now, I don't think people can be free until they recognize this. In the same way, Bessie Smith was much freer, all as terrible as this may sound, much freer than the people who murdered her or let her die, And Big Bill Broomsey was a much freer man than these success-ridden people running around on Madison Avenue today. If you can accept the worst, as someone said to me, then you can see the best. But if you think life is a great big glorious plum pudding, you'll end up in the madhouse, which is where,
To perhaps even extend the examples you just offered, the little girl who walked into the Little Rock schoolhouse or the Charlotte, North Carolina, and was spat on, was much freer than the white child who sat there with a misconceived notion.
Well, I think the proof that Negroes are much stronger in the South today is simply,
She knew who she was.
She knew who she was. And after all, that child has been coming for a very long time. She didn't come out of nothing. And the Negro families are able to produce such children, and whereas the good white people of the South have yet to make any appearance, proves something awful about the moral state of the South. Those people in Tallahassee who are never in the streets when the mobs are there, well, why aren't they? It's their town, too.
What about someone like Lillian Smith?
Lillian Smith is a great, I think a very great and heroic and very lonely figure, obviously, She has very few friends in that little hamlet in Georgia where she carries on so gallantly. She's paid a tremendous price for trying to do what she thinks is right. And the price is terribly, terribly high. The only way for the price to become a little less is for more people to do it.
Because here is someone of the South, a minority of one, and perhaps a few prototypes here and there. This leads to I'm looking for your book now, and I feel guilty not having finished it before interviewing you. I'm sure somebody has something about majority and minority, perhaps, but the majority is not necessarily right all the time.
The majority is usually, I hate to say this, wrong. You know, I think there's a great confusion in this country anyway about that. You know, I don't.
Ibsen's enemy of the people.
Yes, yes. You know, I think that I really think seriously. There's a division of labor in the world, and some people are here to. I can see. Well, let me put it this way. There's so many things I'm not good at. I can't drive a truck. You know, I couldn't run a bank. Well, all right. So that you know, other people have to do that. Well, in a way, they're responsible to me, and I'm responsible to them. You know, and my responsibility to them is to try to tell the truth as I see it. Not so much about my private life; it's about their private lives. You know, so that there is in the world a standard. You know, for all of us. You know, to which we, you know, which will get you through your trouble, because your trouble's always coming. You know, and your Cadillacs don't get you through it, and neither do psychiatrists, incidentally. You know, all to get you through it really is some faith in life, which is not so easy to achieve. Now, when we talk about majorities and minorities, you know, I always had the feeling that this country is talking about a kind of popularity contest, you know, in which everybody works together, you know, towards some absolutely hideously material end. But in truth, I think that, you know, politicians, for example, in the South, where, you know, it's shown most clearly, I think all the Southern politicians have failed their responsibility to the white people of the South. Somebody in the South must know that obviously the situation, the status quo will not exist another 100 years. And their irresponsibility is to prepare the people who are now forming those mobs, prepare those people for that day, you know, to minimize the damage to them, even. Now, the majority rule in the South is not a majority rule at all. It's a mob rule. And what these mobs fill is a moral vacuum, which is created by the lack of a leader, you know. And it seems to me this is the way the world is. And I'm not talking about dictatorships. I mean that statesmen, you know, and people who are sitting in government are supposed to know more about government than people who are driving trucks and digging potatoes and trying to raise their children. That's what you're in the office for.
Someone then with a sense of history, perhaps.
Yes, which is precisely what we don't have here.
Sense of history.
Yes, if you don't know what happened behind you, you have no idea what's happening around you. You know, and that's a law.
Earlier, Jim, you mentioned that for a national policy to be straightened out, the private policies, the private lives, individual lives must be. And you spoke, too, of your job as a writer. You've got to write. And in this chapter with Bergman, the Northern Protestant, there's a beautiful comment here. All art is a kind of confession, more or less oblique. Mm-hmm. All artists, if they're to survive, are forced at last to tell the whole story, to vomit the anguish up. All of it, the literal offensive when you speak of Bergman, but all art is a kind of confession, as you apparently do in all your writings.
I think it has to be a kind of confession. I don't mean a true confession in the sense of that dreary magazine. But I mean, the effort, it seems to me, is if you can examine and face your life, you can discover the terms in which you're connected to other lives. And they can discover, too, the terms in which they're connected to other people. It's happened to every one of us, I'm sure. You know, that one has read something which you thought only happened to you, and you discover that it happened 100 years ago to Dostoevsky. And this is a very great liberation, you know, for the suffering, struggling person who always thinks that he's alone, you know. This is why it's important. It is not important, you know, for any... I don't think that art would not be important if life were not more important, you know. And life is important. And life is mainly, you know, most of us, no matter what we say, are walking in the dark, whistling in the dark. Nobody knows what's going to happen to him one moment to the next or how he will bear it. You know, and this is irreducible, and it's true for everybody. Now, it is true that the nature of society has to be, you know, to create among its citizens an illusion of safety. But it's also absolutely true that the safety is always necessarily an illusion, and artists are here to disturb the peace.
Artists are here to disturb the peace?
Yes, they have to disturb the peace. Otherwise, chaos, you know.
Life is risk.
It is indeed. It is. It always is. It always is. And people have to know this. Somewhere they have to know it in order to get through their risks.
So the safety itself is wholly illusory.
Yes,
Safety.
there's no such a thing as safety on this planet. You know, no one knows that much. No one ever will. Not alone about the world, but about himself. That's why it's, you know, of course it's unsafe. And people in some way have to know this. And this is what the whole sense of tragedy is really all about. And people I think that a sense of tragedy is a kind of embroidery or something irrelevant which you can take or, you know, leave. But in fact, it's a necessity. That's what the blues are all about. It's what the spirituals are about. It is the ability to look on things as they are and survive your losses, or even not survive them, but to know that they're coming. Because to know they're coming is only possible insurance you have, some faint insurance, that you will survive them.
The book is Nobody Knows My Name, and it's Dial, and he's written 2 novels prior. I hope they're still in print.
Yes, yeah.
Giovanni's Room.
And Go Tell It
and
on
Go
the Mountain.
Tell It on the Mountain. And the forthcoming novel,
Another Country.
Another Country, it's called.
It's about this country.
About this country. Perhaps one last question, James Baldwin. Who are you now?
Who indeed? Well, I may be able to tell you quite who I am, but I think I'm discovering who I'm not. I want to be an honest man, and I want to be a good writer. And I don't know if one ever gets to be what one wants to be. I think you just have to play it by ear and pray for rain.
Thank you very much, James Baldwin. Of all the guests we've had in the past several years of the Wax Museum, perhaps the one who's caused the most conversation, not controversy really, never controversy amongst people of enlightenment, yet questions, probing questions asked and being made to think. Of all the guests we've had, Jimmy Baldwin is certainly the one who's caused much of that conversation. And incidentally, the issue of perspective with the James Baldwin interview is now, I imagine, something of a collector's item. And James Baldwin is our guest once again. It's a few days after the abbreviated heavyweight championship fight, which he came to Chicago to cover for a national magazine. James Baldwin, so much has happened to you since the couple of years ago of the interview. You've been to different lands and you've been involved in different enterprises. What has happened to you? Where do we begin? With you, your thoughts? Have there been changes in your way of thinking since we've talked?
It's a very good question. Yes, I think so. It would be hard to say what kind of changes. On the other hand, maybe there have not been changes at all. Maybe, I just discovered, maybe you simply you discover more about the road you're on, and that you discover more about the things you believe, because life forces you to act on what you believe. So I don't know if I can say that there's been a great change in my thinking, but there's been a great change somewhere in me, which I can't put my finger on.
Well, let's perhaps be more specific then. The change in you as a writer. You've written a book since then. You spoke of the book, Another Country,
yeah,
at a time when you were writing in Switzerland, and the book has come out since and has received reviews that are pro and con.
Very pro and very con. But, very bewildering reception. I don't know what I expected. I like the book myself, of course. One has to say that. But I mean, I do. It seems to have frightened some people. Why? It would be very hard to say, since in some way, after all, it had to frighten me first. And now I can't remember precisely where my areas of distress were, when I was working it out, because it's something you blot out of your memory, I think. People seem to think of it as a very harsh and bitter book, and in some ways it is. But in my own mind, anyway, it's a very affirmative book. And if I may be corny about it, it's meant to be bitter when it's bitter, the way medicine is bitter. I'm trying to excavate, if I can use that word, something about what is really happening in America, according to me, and from my very limited point of view, my limited vision, which is hardly ever expressed. And it's really a book about the nature of the American loneliness and how dangerous that is, how hard it is here for people to establish any real communion with each other, and the chances they have to take in order to do it.
At this point, you make the loneliness and the danger of loneliness and the difficulty of communication in America here. You think there's less of that in the countries you visited?
I think so, yes. It's, by which I don't mean, it's always very difficult when you talk about America. People always say, well, is it any better anywhere else? Which is irrelevant. But yes, I do think so. I think that even in France, which is certainly, a very troubling and troubled and corrupt, many ways corrupt country, there is a certain level of personal, how can I put it, an assumption on the part of the person of a certain largeness and a certain freedom, which is very hard to come by here. In Africa, which I just left, which lacks, God knows, a great many things, it has one thing which we don't have, which is a kind of joy among the people, which sounds that always sounds corny. The word joy is always terribly suspect.
Well, tell me more about that, about this joy among the people and some of the countries that you visited.
Well, it began I went there with one of my sisters, and the way it began turned out to be typical of the way it was going to continue. We were standing in line at Dakar, the customs shed, waiting to be allowed in, because we'd arrived in Dakar without any visas, which was my fault. Well, while we were standing on line, a little girl of about 3 or maybe 4, but certainly not more than that, who was standing some distance from us, holding her mother's hand, looked over at my sister and smiled, and my sister smiled at her. And then the little girl left her mother and came running over to Gloria and made Gloria pick her up. And all the children we met in West Africa were like that. And I never saw, or I saw very rarely, a crying child. And I never saw anybody beat a child. And now this sounds, I suppose it's very dangerous thing to do, to draw any conclusions of any kind from this. And yet it seemed to me it was very, very important. Someone said to me it's impossible to be an orphan in Africa because all the children belong to all the, to all the grown-ups. And as far as I could see, and everywhere I was, this was entirely true. And you could tell it by the way children treated you.
By the way children treated you?
Well, the way they came to you.
With a certain kind of openness.
Entire openness. No self-consciousness. No. There you were, and there they were, and obviously, since you were grown up.
Well, since you're talking about some of the West African countries and the sense of joy, which perhaps could be equated with sense of freedom too, I suppose.
Yes, a certain kind of freedom. Yes.
Perhaps some of the countries, what is going on in the fields of, say, theater, writing, creativity.
Yeah.
Do you find a great deal of?
That's harder to assess for me because how can I put it? In a way, there's a great barrier of language. Now, I don't mean that quite the way it might sound. For example, there are some poets working in French, West African poets working in the French language, who are very, who are very important. And of course, one thinks immediately of Senghor, or you think of Aimé Césaire. But when I say the barrier of language, I'm referring to the fact that there are so many languages in Africa, and that in time, I think at about this time, really, poets are about to be produced out of these various dialects, who will then have to work in French or in English,
this becomes a problem then that is unique, is it not, to Africa?
I think,
that is, say, Nigeria would then have such a variety of dialects and languages that it's hard to pinpoint who the creative spirits are
that's right.
centrally.
That's right, because there may be a very great poet living in this village, writing in a language which has no currency except in the village, or
But I imagine then
tribe.
what will come out of this eventually.
Oh, I think something very rich, and very
variegated too, won't
yes,
it?
That's right, and it will change French and English.
Well,
thank heaven.
It will change. You mean? Do you feel there'll be a synthesis in language, or?
Well, the problem they have in education, for example, is how to, let us say, if you're a school teacher in West Africa, and you're teaching in English or in French, it scarcely matters. The problem is how to translate the images of the language which the people speak. The tribal language which they speak. They have a way of saying, for example, let's say wall or water, and a context for it, wall or water, which is not English or French. Now, in order to teach these people how to speak English or French, when it's first got to make the word water connect with their word for water, their word for wall, and where this has not been done, it has not been done really. You observe a great many Africans, in English especially, using the language in a very stilted Victorian way. it's obviously not become really their possession yet.
Aha. So
You
something
see?
becomes rather formal when someone is new to a
That's right,
language. The
that's right,
formality
that's right.
takes precedence over the
Yeah.
complete ease.
Exactly.
But
the problem-
eventually-
yeah, the problem is for the experiences of these villages to work its way into the English language, and in that sense, it would have to vary, and change English language in very much the same way, but more violently probably than that the American Negro, the presence of the Negro in this country has had a tremendous effect on the way all Americans speak.
On this point, for example, the use of certain American slang or the so-called hip talk,
That's right.
have become part, in the past, that kind of has become part of the American lexicon.
That's right. That's right. A great deal of the American lexicon comes out of the spirituals, for example. In the frame of reference, even.
And so in Africa, with so many of the languages and so many of the dialects, the language that eventually will come forth should be
Should be
fantastically
a
rich.
fantastic language, yes, because there's so much unexpressed, which has got to arrive at a level of expression.
Of the countries that you visited, Nigeria,
I didn't get to Nigeria.
No.
I went from Senegal to Guinea to Sierra Leone to Liberia to the Ivory Coast to Ghana.
is there one of the countries that you visited you found the most, what's the word, electricity perhaps, in the creative sense of it?
Well, all of them are electrical in different ways. All of them are electrical in different ways, and they all have different attitudes towards their relationship to Europe, which changes, the climate in the country. I liked Sierra Leone very much. For reasons that it's hard to say, but in Sierra Leone we were very lucky. We had a great friend, a driver, a man who drove us around, who's now here in this country with the UN. And he knew everyone in Sierra Leone, and if he didn't know them, he was related to them. So that we had, we went through many villages and talked to many people, and he helped us, he interpreted for us. And in some ways, since he was so deeply involved in the life of Sierra Leone himself, and just walking around with him was very illuminating, about the problems in Sierra Leone and the potentials in Sierra Leone. It's hard to talk about creative energy in any concrete sense yet. I brought back a lot of manuscripts, which I haven't yet had time to read.
Yours then, it's a series you're planning for the New Yorker
Yeah.
magazine,
Mhm.
and yours then will be a series of impressions, won't they? First impressions.
Will have to be, because
Yeah.
the Africans kept asking me if I were going to write a book about them. They resent those people who come to Africa
To write
and
books.
spend 3 weeks and
Yes.
go home as African experts.
It's first impressions then.
Yeah, yeah.
I know the question I want to ask you. It's been in the back of my mind here, rolling around like a loose cannonball. I know what it is now. Think of Africa. We may have touched on this slightly during the past interview, and the history, the tradition, long before the kidnappings occurred. Now, with the new democracies there, is there a digging back into the civilizations? Has there
Yes.
been? Have you come across this?
It was a great effort to dig back and to resurrect, to excavate what was there before Europe. But it's not so easy to do, because, for many reasons, above all for political reasons, because West Africa is one cannot really speak yet authoritatively, I don't think, of the new democracies there. They're democracies in
State of flux.
in a state of flux, or as it were, in progress. But there are too many elements, too many disparate elements to somehow be made into something homogeneous. One begins to realize, for example, the idea of nations is really a very new idea, and quite apart from its intrinsic value, which one may or may not question, but that's something else. But that most of the people in Africa, as far as I could tell, and most of the people in Africa don't live in the cities, after all, they live in the villages, don't really seriously think of themselves as being Ghanaian or Guinean or whatever, or still less as African, but as tribal people. Now, I don't mean this in any derogatory way. I mean that is the way the life is set up. This is the way the villages operate and have for years, and it was also very useful to Europe to have it that way. So there was nothing, very little was ever done to undermine it or to overthrow it in that sense. It was useful to have the chief, used by the British what the British call indirect rule. Now, this had disastrous effects in other ways, but in a way it tended to confirm, the hermetic quality of I think, of African life, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I follow this, yes.
Now, if the problem in all these nations really is somehow, to inculcate in the populations a sense of a new identity, really, because that is precisely what they are on the threshold of. But it's not so easy, it's not so easy to achieve this.
Establishing something that hasn't been there for centuries, perhaps was there centuries before, perhaps, we don't know.
Yes.
But, or perhaps the tribal setup was there from
no one
times.
knows enough.
But it's just to start then finding the new identity where there was none before.
Essentially, yes.
But
yes.
at the same time, among the people with whom you spoke, is the feeling that some of the tribal aspects must be retained.
Oh yes. And I myself think this, though I probably have no right to speak. But which tribal aspects are to be retained? How? What value will they have? And you must remember too that all of this is not in the Western press. But all this is after all being done under the great shadow of Europe, and in many places in opposition to it. The one thing that struck me very forcibly, not the one thing, but many, but that most of the Europeans in Africa were entirely unable or unwilling to accept any of the implications of their role in Africa. That is to say, they were always very defensive about it. And this, of course, has a disastrous effect on their relations with the African, and it tends to create a necessity on the part of the African to identify himself as Europeans have, according to racial blocks, on the basis of color, really, because white people still do, and white people still have a vast amount of power in Africa, and this is rather frightening, thing to think about. But the Europeans continually claim there was absolutely nothing in Africa before they got there, which is obviously not true. And the Africans, it's a great temptation to make an extravagant counterclaim, so that in some places in Africa, there's a whole new history being rewritten or rather invented,
yes.
Which it turns out that the Africans taught most of the world what we know. Now, neither side is true, But this is the whole tricky area of politics and economics.
To even make a pun, neither white nor black.
Neither white nor black. Yeah.
The Jim Baldwin, your impressions, obviously, as you say, are first impressions. I notice you're being circumspect in your comments too, because they are your first. And
I don't know anything about
You don't
Africa.
tend to be a pundit.
No.
But at the same time, these impressions are rather vivid and graphic ones.
Yeah. Yes,
A sense of joy is there with all the conflicts involved.
Yes. Well, they have a relationship to each other, which is never become anything resembling, never achieved the nightmare self-consciousness of relations people have in the West, especially here.
You've come back. See, no, we're now talking on two separate subjects. Earlier you talked about loneliness, that was in your novel, and now about Africa, and they're both connected. The subject of loneliness again, you see, that you did not find there.
No, not that loneliness. There's another loneliness.
What
there.
kind?
Well, the loneliness, for example, of some people I used to know in Paris years ago, who were living in Paris because they left Senegal or Guinea, and who went back to Senegal or Guinea when these countries became free. Well, they've been away a long time. They've been in Europe for 5 or 10 years, and some of them, I know a dancer who was, a star in Paris, and it's very difficult when they go back. And neither is this meant to be in any sense derogatory. What I do mean is that if you lived in Paris for 10 years, a certain way, and lived in a European frame of reference, and have gotten used to such simple manners as the fact that when you pick up a telephone and dial it, that it works. Well, it is a great wrench to go back to Guinea when nothing works, really. And this, nothing works because there's no capital, and there is not a cadre yet of Guineans who can
train technicians.
There are no technicians, and in a country which is yours, but from which you are and always will be in a way divorced, because of your experience. And this obtains in every level, from the most private, that is the difficulty of a Guinean male going back to a country where women are still not educated. If he's been if he's been dealing for all these years with Western women or with westernized African women, and his ways, his manners, which make him rather strange in all the villages. It's not a hopeless estrangement, but it does create a certain kind of loneliness, a certain kind of. I admire these people, I must say, very much. But it is a problem for them.
With that loneliness that they found, the new kind of loneliness, leaving the home of their childhood and coming to a city of sophistication and in technological development,
Yeah.
except going back now to their home in a state of being rebuilt,
Yes,
a new home.
yes.
Yet the problem of, I suppose, material comforts, but more than that.
More than that, much more profound than material
Yeah.
comforts. The very grave problems of what precisely is the relationship of Africa to Europe, which is an immense problem. Which way, how you're confronted with the necessity of really, literally, of creating a country with your fingernails. You got to dam the rivers, Europe never did. You got to build roads, Europe never did. You got to educate the children, Europe never did. You have a million things to do, and Africans, are still, because of our asininity, trapped in the Cold War. I have not met a single African who was at least attracted to Moscow or Peking, and they resent, and I don't blame them, our innocent assumption that they're such children that they can make up their own minds. And there's no reason to suppose, by the way, that they could imitate us either.
So then what they are
Or
seeking...
that they should.
Or that they should. What they are seeking then is their own way.
They are
Need
trying
not
to
be
find-
west nor
that's
east,
right.
but their own way.
Something else, and I think, from my own point of view, that the world could certainly stand, a new way.
A new way. Loneliness again. This is obviously, it's a key aspect of life that's on your mind, Jim, since it was one of the basic aspects of your novel, Another Country, which I must admit I haven't read yet, and I apologize.
I'll get it for you.
Thank you. But the theme of loneliness, there's a loneliness that the Parisian dancer had, the Senegalese Parisian, returning to her home country. Did you find this kind of loneliness when you were in Paris and you came back to America? So here was a wholly different problem.
Yes, in a way I did. I never thought about it in that way before. In a way I certainly did. I came back, I came back in a certain way you never can come back. And I had to build a whole new life, because the life that I left, you can't pick it up. Old friends are not old friends anymore. Something has happened to you, something has happened to them. You can't talk to them. There's a great gap between you, There's certain habits you have lost, certain habits you've acquired. In certain ways you become more definite, because time does pass, and so therefore there are certain things that you no longer tolerate, really, and certain things you no longer need to do. And every voyager who leaves this country and comes back to that country is always regarded with some suspicion by the people whom he left, when he returns. And you can't endlessly go about, apologizing for having left either. So you have no choice but to pick up from where you are and try to establish a life in the terms of the country in which you are living now, which I found very difficult to do, really, to tell the truth. It's astonishing I never thought of that, My solution in a way was to work, which I suppose says all that can be said, about what happened when I came back. I'm still very lonely here in a way,
What is go ahead, sorry, what way?
Well, I don't know. There's certain things that I've learned to take for granted, certain assumptions I make, which I really do assume, that there's really no difference between whites and blacks. It's not something. It's not an attitude of mine. It's I don't operate on that basis. I really don't. Most people here do, and they do in the most unexpected contexts, on the most unexpected levels. So that you always find yourself in the position of either shocking them by some inadvertent remark, or being shocked by them, being shocked in fact by their naivete, by their profound immaturity, by their, one could almost say, their cowardice. I consider, this is a very rash thing to say, but I consider that I'm 38 years old, and if I haven't found out something of the facts of life now, I never will. And I think I know some of the facts of life. I've had to swallow them. And then there are moments in this country when you feel as though you're trapped in a kindergarten. Trying to spell out to very well-meaning children how to spell cat, what apple is, and they're very earnest about it.
It's this. Let's assume for the moment well-meaning. This is an assumption, but this immaturity that you've come across in the matter of race relations, for one.
Well, it's not only in race relations,
but in everything.
It's in love. It's in politics. God knows, I don't believe, for example, that there are 3 out of 4 Americans who have any idea of what really happened in Cuba, what our role was there, and what the meaning of the present impasse is. And they've taken their decisions about Cuba from the press, which I think has been extremely irresponsible in this case. And I'm very prepared to act out on a principle which I have no means whatever of understanding. And don't really understand the danger that Cuba represents. Cuba represents a very great danger, but we are responsible for having created it. It's this level of immaturity that I mean, which is so frightening.
Of the acceptance of cliches as a truth,
and
as the whole truth,
and the inability, the refusal almost to think. The same way that people suppose, I gather they suppose, that there is some legitimate debate between Mississippi and the United States. I don't see that there are 2 sides to that question. It's a question which should have been resolved 100 years ago, and it never had 2 sides.
This is rather interesting. The 2 sides to a crazy kind of coin here, and the coin is not legitimate metal, apparently. And that's the seeing only one side vis-a-vis Cuba, but seeing 2 sides vis-a-vis Mississippi.
Yes. And by the way, this has great repercussions in Africa, too. I'm very glad I'm not in West Africa this morning, because to try to explain to anyone in Africa what the government is doing, why those mobs in New Orleans, why this fantastic hassle about letting somebody have a cup of coffee, is a very unenviable task, because it can't be defended. And on the other hand, one has no right, I think one has no right, to allow the Africans to cling to or to be submerged by all their misapprehensions about the United States. One is always in a position when you're out of the United States of having to say, well, it's not that bad. Even though something in the back of your mind whispers, maybe it is, but still, one has got at whatever cost to try to achieve some kind of clarity, Therefore, you have to try to explain the relationship of the states to each other and the whole history which has resulted in this terrible impasse, But irreducibly, the African asks you ultimately, well, if I were in your country and if I were an American, what would happen to me there? This handicaps all the American efforts in Africa, much more than Americans are willing to realize. And when you have a situation in which a government is willing to invade Cuba in order to free the Cubans, as it says, and cannot get one Negro boy into the University of Mississippi, the African wonders, who do you think you're fooling?
Yes.
And I don't blame him.
There's another point that you raise here that I find amusing and sad, not too amusing, really. The point, it is bad for our reputation abroad. So we say this is not evil per se, but the editorial so often says, oh boy, what they are going to make of this.
Yeah, well, that's
and we must behave in a Christian manner only because others will think ill of us if we don't.
No, we have to do it because it is right, and the reason we don't do it because it's right is because we are so immature to come back to that, and have been so unwilling to think hard problems through.
So it's a combination of 2 aspects of life that touch you: the loneliness and the immaturity, and perhaps they're one, aren't they?
Yes,
the loneliness may stem from the immaturity.
Yes. Well, you have the right to be immature quite some time, But if you're immature, let us say, beyond the age of 27, you're not any longer immature, you are frozen, And the only way you could then grow up would demand then a cataclysm, You have to be broken up into pieces and then put back together again, which most people can't survive, in order to become a man or a woman. But if you're frozen in this peculiar way, then you can only be lonely because you haven't got any basis on which to operate, on which to leap out to others. You have no dance floor.
No dance floor, yes, good. Jim, how then, what do you suggest for a process of unfreezing?
Oh, God.
Yeah.
I don't know, really, I don't know. You would have to. One would have to begin by doing very dangerous things. It's such an individual matter. You have to ask yourself very hard questions about the way you want to raise your child. You know, which standards, which values you think he should accept, and which standards, which values you think he should not accept. And you have to be you have to be dangerously rigid about it. You know, I think, and this is not a very attractive way to put it, but if you don't believe in God, well, I think you are obliged to raise your child that way. You know, and if you do, of course, you are obliged to raise him that way. I think what I'm trying to say is that we have no right any longer to compromise for expediency's sake and to go along with the social pressures because it seems easier to do it that way. I think precisely that sense of expediency is what is responsible for our trouble now. But you see how difficult it becomes on a purely social level, and on a deeper level, one has got to ask oneself what one really believes. Most of the liberals I know have really got to ask themselves what they really feel about miscegenation, on a personal level, and not as a kind of abstract favor to me. I don't care what I'm not important here right now. What is important is what you really think, what you really feel.
It has to be personal then. It comes right
Finally, it
down
has to be personal. Everyone wants to avoid this, but this is where everything begins.
That someone speaks as of course miscegenation is right, as you say, in an abstract sociological way, but then it has to be thought of in personal, immediate terms.
That's right. Otherwise, it really doesn't mean anything. And what is worse, if you've taken an attitude but you've never examined it, when a crisis comes, you'll be surprised at what you can do, what base things you can do.
And what good things you can do?
What good things you can do if you know what you're doing. But in that case, it cannot be an attitude.
Yes, yes.
It has to be a reality.
What base things you can do if you're not as fully mature as you think you are.
That's right. That's right. When the attitude is called, when you're called upon to take a risk to defend what you say you believed.
And then comes the period of rationalization.
That's right.
Of the excuses.
Yes, I wouldn't mind,
Yes,
but I don't care if she marries him. However.
Yes. So it's the buts and the howevers that somehow must be pinpointed.
That's right.
And
that's right.
Whenever we hear the but or the however, no matter how well-meaning that speaker might be, we've apparently got to stay with that but
that's right.
However.
That's right, because that's where the key is. That's where the key is. What is really demanded in this country, I think, it's very important, and it probably won't be done, is that we surrender the notion of being a white nation. It is an absolutely useless idea anyway, And with 22 million Negroes here, occupying the peculiar and dangerous position that they do, we cannot be called a white nation anymore. And if we could make this revision in our optique.
This then is wrong. The acceptance of the phrase or the idea or the image, a word I hate, image, or the vision of white nation is just as wrong as, say, I don't know if this is the black Muslim idea, not say a black nation. Both are equally wrong.
They're both equally wrong, yes. And I would hate to see the old nightmare repeated for the next 2,000 years, with, as we say, the shoe on the other foot.
The shoe on the other foot. And there are far, far more people of color in the world than Caucasians.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, too, something, I suppose, that we, as white people, not from the standpoint of just protection, but from the standpoint of moralities, we should think of, standpoint of reality.
Yes.
There are far more people of color in the world than Caucasians.
This is the way it is. This is the way it is. And we all know, we don't all know, but
we are not we are not the anointed. We're the self-anointed, but not the anointed.
Yes, exactly. We're not the chosen of God, as as white people always seem to think. Because it creates a very peculiar situation in which white people seem to think that the closer a Negro gets to be like them, the better he is. Well, I don't accept that proposition at all. I mean, I don't mean to suggest that the more you become like me, the better off you are either. But I don't see any reason why we can't live, in peace, as it were, and enjoy the things which are different
with our own uniqueness.
That's right. That's right.
I'm thinking of you and on a panel show a couple of years ago, and he was a good man, and he said to you somewhere in the discussion, it was rather heated, You held your own very well. But he said to you, I accept you. And you said to him, I don't mean to be rude, sir, but who are you to accept me?
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. And most white people make the assumption quite innocently. You know.
Who am I to accept you? Yes, really. Think about it. I'm trying to find where the holy oil came from, and I can't find it out. Jimmy, I know that your comments on all these matters are perceptive and deep, and they affect the listeners. Are we interested, everyone is, in what you as a creative artist do? You finished the book, I understand you're working on a play.
I'm working on a play, yeah. I'm going to take that plunge, which I should have done maybe a couple of years ago. I guess I'm doing it to see if I can. I have two plays, actually. One play is nearly finished, and it'll probably be done off-Broadway this fall, as soon as I get the second act in some kind of shape. The other play is longer, not scheduled for anything yet except the Actors Studio, where I intend to work it out, well, I guess come spring, if I can get a hold. I want to work with Sidney Poitier in it.
Yeah. Well, he'll be in it, you mean?
Well, I can't speak for him.
No, but I mean, it's a role involving...
We are going to work at the workshop together, you know.
Would it be premature to ask you what the theme is?
It's difficult to say. It takes place in the Deep South, 2 acts. First in the church, second in the courthouse. It's framed within the play begins after a Negro boy of about 20 has been killed, and no one quite knows who did it. It's a very small town, which is an embattled town because Negroes are boycotting several stores, and the town has begun to feel it. The premise of the play is that we are pretending to search for the boy's murderer. So what we see is the course of events which led to the murder. And the result of this is, of the 3 people in the play, 3 important people in the play, there are the boy who plays the Negro boy's father, who is one of the leaders in the town. There's a good white man in the town who's about 40, kind of rustabout, well-meaning, and really a very good man. And the murderer. Now, the good white man is the best friend of both the father of the murdered boy and of the murderer. And what happens in the play really is that all these people, or these 2 people, especially the good white man and the good black man, let us say, are forced to examine themselves in a very rigorous way, because finally the responsibility for the murder, which is, according to me, shared by almost everyone in the town, it revolves on them, and especially the white man here, to force the murderer to confess. But the father has also some things to confess of his own, the ways in which he failed.
It's a play then of self-examination and the chain of guilt.
Yeah.
The question, the chain of...
Yeah.
That all, in a sense, being guilty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because isn't this it's funny how a creative spirit today returns, almost inevitably must come to that target.
The guilt.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a terrible conundrum.
Yet cannot be avoided.
No, it can't.
Certainly,
No, it can't.
You must face this.
It's the only way you can accept your responsibility, I suppose. Once you've begun to examine the guilt and also begin to be you have to be released from it in order to function.
I'm not too hip to
But you're never free from
existentialism,
it.
but I think this is de Beauvoir's position, Sartre's position. I think
so.
It's that every man, it's an affirmative, it's
Yeah,
affirmative
I
philosophy.
think it's
that
affirmative,
each
yeah.
man each individual must take a stand, committed, and then the chain of responsibility comes to him, even no matter how much out of it he thinks he is.
That's right. You cannot be innocent.
So this is your play, then.
Yeah.
You cannot be innocent.
Yeah.
Yes. That is not acting, is acting. Not taking part is taking
That's
part.
right. That's right. That's right. There is no place where you can sit down and say it has nothing to do with me.
So this comes back to all of us sitting here and Mississippi and every other aspect that bugs us one way or another.
That's right.
So it comes back to the individual again and James Baldwin. Perhaps one more subject, Jimmy, of your adventures. You've been in town to cover This seems to be in a lighter vein, yet it isn't. It's all connected. The heavyweight fight between Sonny Liston and Patterson, very brief fight, and you spoke to both. Is there anything, in speaking to Floyd Patterson, to Sonny Liston, both American Negroes, both expert, well, something they question in one case, but expert craftsmen, both being champions, you know. Did you have a feeling as an observer of the two men, the phenomenon itself, the fight?
I had a very strong feeling about both of them. I talked more to Floyd Patterson than I did to Liston. I must say I like Floyd Patterson very much and I admire him very much. How can I put it? There's something fantastically gentle and very, again, very lonely and very tough in him, you know. In a way, the only way he's a gentleman. He's a real man. There's something in Congress. There was something for me in Congress, the spectacle of him occupying, you know, in that world. Though that may have something to do with my lack of knowledge of the boxing world. I don't know how to. I can't really say what I felt about Floyd Patterson, except that I suppose what I felt mainly was his immense, you know, and heroic struggle, you know, with his circumstances and with himself, you know, to support the position which, you know, the position of the heavyweight champion of the world, which is in some ways a very baffling position. And I must say something which perhaps rather reckless. When I watched him with the press, and he handled himself, you know, very beautifully, one was yet aware of a great gap between their sense of reality in general. There were exceptions to this, but in general, their sense of reality and his sense of reality. And that he was terribly aware of this gap too, that there were things, elements of him as a man and as a boxer, which they were not prepared in any way whatever to deal with. And it's certainly one of the reasons, you know, that the press has often been so ambiguous about Floyd. He's very proud in a quite intransigent way, and he is simply so far from looking or sounding like what we think of anyway,
so the stereotype
as a boxer,
fighter,
you know, that I think he baffles, you know, and even intimidates, you know, a great many people, and I think he knows this, and I think it increases his loneliness. As for Liston, I liked him very much. He didn't impress me as being as tightly organized, you know, as Floyd, but very direct and very intelligent. Quite apart, you know, the press is entirely wrong about that, and with a great dignity, you know. From the point of view of the press, I suppose is if you were quite right when you compared him earlier to a blues singer.
Big Bill.
Big Bill, yeah.
Very much so.
If he were a singer,
yeah,
the things he says and the way he comes on, you know, would be taken as charming. Yeah. But and let us face it, you know, Liston's criminal record is appalling, I suppose. But I must confess, I am not really particularly appalled by it. Everything depends what he now does with it. But I know too many people who come out of just those situations who are very admirable people, you know, to be able to put him down for that. But because he is not singing, but boxing, and because he has to face the press in a way that a singer doesn't have to do, and because the press has been so uniformly hostile to him, you know, it seems to me that he reacted by being. I didn't feel that he was being outrageous. I felt that he was simply giving as good as he got and holding his own, you know, and that the press took that as being outrageous. And anyone who really talked to him, you know, got a very different impression of him than you get from the newspapers.
So here then with two wholly different figures, each one equally impressive in his own way.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose the big question is what will happen in the development and the discoveries of Floyd Patterson. He made a discovery after he lost his first fight to Johansson, that dark period of his life, and now perhaps
I have a great deal of
yes,
confidence in Floyd. He's on a very lonely journey, one of the loneliest journeys I've ever seen, you know. one of the most beautiful too. I think. I think he has a very long way. I think he will go a very long way.
This has nothing to do with fighting now. We're talking about
No,
Patterson the
no.
man.
What he does actually, in that on that level is by comparison irrelevant. There's something in him which he's got to deal with, and which will take him somewhere which will be very valuable, I think, for all of us.
This is, I know, premature to even mention, but this, it seems to me that Floyd Patterson is the protagonist of some novel or play, certainly.
I've had that suspicion too.
I thought, I'm sure you did. You do. Anything else you want to talk about, James Baldwin? Anything that you feel like talking about now?
Well, we've sort of just bounced around, there are too many things,
The changes. The beginning, we were saying, we spoke about since the time you appeared in this a couple of years ago. You've been different places, things have happened. You said changes in you. And I know it's difficult to say, for you to yourself to say what the changes were in you in outlook.
Well, Marion Moore put it once very well, I think. In fact, she wrote a few lines which in some way, I remembered when I was in trouble. The thing she has, which says, the weak overcomes its menace. The strong overcomes itself. What is there like fortitude? What sap went through that little thread to make the cherry red? And she also said that she was a life prisoner, but reconciled. I'm in some ways more reconciled, I think, than I was 2 years ago.
You're a little more reconciled than you were. That is to the... But you will still be the rebel against that which you consider...
Oh, yeah, to be reconciled is not to be passive, at all. Oh, yes. I don't really consider myself a rebel. I don't know what the word is.
No, that's the wrong word, perhaps. But reconciled. I think the word reconciled is the one that attracts me. Reconciled in what way?
Well, reconciled, I suppose, to the life I have to live and the things I have to do. And you pray that you have enough in the bank to pay all those dues.
Enough in the spiritual bank.
Yeah. You never know whether you do or not, but it's just a chance you have to take. I find myself in a place, which I never calculated, never meant to be in. And, well, you can't escape anything. So if you can't escape it, you've got to act. And since there's no safety anywhere, you might as well take your chances as take anybody else's chances. The odds are just about the same. And if you're doing what you think you should do, at least you can live with yourself. No matter how many other people you find you cannot live with.
And so perhaps in saying this, remember last time, the last question I asked you was, do you know your name? Who are you? And you said you're a writer, and you hope to be a good man and to write well and pray for rain. And this time I say to you, now you know your name even better.
I know it somewhat better than I did. I'll find it out yet, though. So
well, on this journey, let's call this chapter 2, as far as we're concerned, of James Baldwin's journey. And for now we say, so long for now, again, okay. James Baldwin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stan.
About 15 years ago it was, I met James Baldwin. He had been living in Europe and had come back home to the United States, and his book at the time, the one that he'd written just about the time of our first meeting, was Nobody Knows My Name, a series of powerful essays. Since then, of course, James Baldwin is known to a great many Americans as one of the most eloquent of black voices in our country. And we'll hear perhaps the voice of James Baldwin. He's my guest this morning. His new book is called The Devil Finds Work, dial to the publishers, and it's his impressions of films, American films, on him, indeed on our society, specific films and actors and actresses. And we'll, after this message, my guest, James Baldwin. Bessie Smith, of course, the Empress of the Blues, singing of a disaster, of a flood. Sitting with me, hearing Bessie Smith on this recording, is James Baldwin, brilliant young American writer, but perhaps a more specific description of Mr. Baldwin, since he is one of the rare men in the world who seems to know who he is today. James Baldwin, brilliant young Negro-American writer. And as you listen to this, Jim, to this record of Bessie Smith, what's your feeling?
It's very hard to describe that feeling. The first time I ever heard this record was in Europe, and under very different circumstances than I'd ever listened to Bessie in New York. And what struck me was the fact that she was singing, as you say, about a disaster, which had almost killed her, and she'd accepted it and was going beyond it. It's a fantastic kind of understatement in it. It's the way I want to write. You know, when she says, "My house fell down and I can't live there no more," it's a great sentence. It's a great achievement.
The way you want to write, you say.
Yeah.
I'm looking now at page 5 of your new book, and it's a remarkable one. Nobody Knows My Name. It's a series of essays, articles, opinions of James Baldwin, more notes of a native son, the subtitle. And on page 5, the reason I'd chosen the Bessie Smith record, because on page 5 you write of your being in Europe, you're in Switzerland.
Yes.
And you said you came armed with 2 Bessie Smith records and a typewriter. And I began to try to recreate the life that I had first known as a child, from which I'd spent so many years in flight. And it was Bessie Smith who, through her tone and her cadence, helped me dig back to the way I myself must have spoken when I was little. And I remember the things I had heard and seen and felt. I buried them deep. And here's the part, I had never listened to Bessie Smith in America. In the same way for years I never touched watermelon. But in Europe, I couldn't reconcile myself.
Yes, well, how can I put that? That winter in Switzerland, I was working on my first novel, which I thought I would never be able to finish. And I finally realized in Europe that one of the reasons that I couldn't finish this novel was because I was ashamed of where I'd come from and where I'd been, and ashamed of the life in the church, and ashamed of my father, ashamed of the blues, and ashamed of jazz, and of course ashamed of watermelon, because it was, you know, all of these stereotypes that the country inflicts on Negroes. You know, that we all eat watermelon, or we all do nothing but sing the blues and all that.
That was 15 years ago.
Yes, my friend, that was 15 years ago.
Much has happened since then.
Yes, much, and I don't know how to put this, a lot has happened, and yet I'm forced to say that, to paraphrase the French saying, plus ça change, more changes, more it remains the same. It's very difficult to make sense out of it.
I'm thinking, Jimmy, James Baldwin, since that beginning, that time we first met 15 years ago, Martin Luther King came into being, I remember the civil rights movement, back and forth. Your book, of course, deals with your impressions of films. You were young and in films today. Where are we now?
Where are we now? I don't know, Studs. You know, it's one of the things I'm trying to find out in this peculiar journey. I've been in and out of the country for the last 2 years, more here than there, in fact. And you're quite right. You know, when we met, Martin Luther King was at the beginning of his career. Malcolm X was virtually unknown, actually. No one had heard of Medgar Evers, and of course, no one had heard of George Jackson or Angela Davis or Huey Newton or Bobby Seale, and that whole era was still in front of us. And after all those marches, all those petitions, and all that slaughter, and not only the publicized slaughter, not merely the assassinations, but the boys and girls who did not survive the civil rights movement in many, many ways. Out of all that came Vietnam, came Nixon, came Watergate, and the present scene. So that one could be very, very bitter, you know, and despairing. But I'm not. Now, there's a reason for that, which I can't quite locate. You know, it isn't simply that I'm insane, you know, becoming senile.
Now, let's try to find that, and perhaps in this, going through this book of yours, The Devil Finds Work, which are reflections of film, let's, for the moment, you're not despairing. There's a sense of affirmation you see here
yes,
somewhere.
There's something happening.
Can
here.
you pinpoint that?
I don't know how to pinpoint it. It's something you do with, on what was sounding a very corny level. Those of us, black and white, in this country who did survive the era, who were a part of it, and in one way or another, all of us were, you know. I think, in my own case, perhaps, but I'm not thinking of myself. I'm thinking of other boys and girls who have been through much worse, things than I did. Learned something out of it. Learned some tremendous kind of, and mainly silent affirmation. But one of the results of it is, in these last few weeks, and I've been on the road. One of the things which began to strike me, and I say this without any comment necessarily, is that nobody has asked me any questions about white people. No one is the difficulty I might have had some years ago in trying to deal with a young person and trying to say that it is too simple to dismiss all white people as hunkies. It is so easy to dismiss all white Americans as villains because we are a part of this country too, and it is very important not to become what you think you hate. In some way, that seems to be over, which I conclude from that on a very serious level, black people in this country are no longer controlled in their minds by whatever white people think they think. And this in spite of such horrifying scenes as Boston, in spite of the fact that the legal and social situation in this country has not really changed at all. Something nevertheless is changing, and some kind of identity is being forged out of all of this in ways which no one could have foreseen, and no one quite knows where it's going to go, but the country is changing.
Yes, there has been that change, imperceptible though it may be, you sense it. And so there's childhood. We go back now. This is all related. A childhood of a small black kid in Harlem, Jimmy Baldwin, and you see Joan Crawford on film, nothing but impressions. You see this elegant white woman.
That's right. You see, but she's an elegant white woman indeed. But she's a figure out of really a figure out of a fairy tale. You have to put yourself in a child's mind. And the whole miracle of all that movement. Everyone forgets. Now we're used to movies and television, but there was a moment when you and I both saw it for the first time.
Yes.
And it was a kind of amazing, that light flickering, and and the motion picture. It really is a motion picture. And you believe everything in it. You believe Tom Mix and the horse.
Tom Mix and his white hat.
And his white hat, and his white horse. I think the horse was white.
Yes.
And the Indians.
And then there was the Indian who had the gall, Philip Reed and the Last Mohicans, to actually court Miss Angel, the blonde.
Yes.
He got his comeuppance, though.
He certainly did. He, if I remember correctly, he ended at the bottom of a cliff. Yeah.
But then you saw Betty Davis, and something interesting happened.
Yeah, that was fascinating. It was kind of terrifying, too. But this says a lot about me, I'm sure. I was a kid, and kids are kids, right? And so my nickname was Frog Eyes, and which meant that I was very unhappy about my eyes, simply, and bewildered too because my father didn't like my eyes, but my mother, has my eyes, and I couldn't get it together because I thought and I think my mother's, a very beautiful woman. I simply, like a kid cannot get it together. Something is wrong here somewhere. And I saw Miss Davis on the screen with these enormous eyes popping, and I forgot she was white. I forgot all I saw was her eyes, and I concluded that my father had made some terrifying mistake somewhere, because obviously, being Popeye was not the affliction which he said it was,
And
obviously, I was right about my mother because there was Betty Davis, on the screen. She was being paid a lot of money for that. So, so obviously, if that were true, well then, okay, I could pop my eyes too.
Yeah. And wasn't there something else? Something about Betty, her manner and her walk.
Something defiant.
Defiant.
I couldn't put it that way to myself then, but something defiant.
Now, you saw...
I was already in that position without knowing it.
She was and then you saw her later on in this quite remarkable film, In Our Life.
Yeah.
In This Our Life. And a lot of other black people were taken with her. What was it she did there?
I think today she would be called, in the day's parlance, she'd be called funky, And I do remember In This Our Life because of the moment I mentioned in the book when the scene with her, the scene with the black chauffeur was cut out. And the Amsterdam News got wind of this somehow.
Oh, if you point
And
this
created
out, that Betty Davis was a hit-and-run driver, very
Yeah,
rich.
very rich Southern
Charles
girl.
Coburn was her uncle, I remember that.
That's right.
And she hit this guy killed, and she wanted to blame the black, wanted him to take the blame.
That's right.
But if
He
he'd take the
refused.
blame, she would offer him,
Anything.
and she meant anything.
Yeah, that's right. This is very implicit in the scene. It's a terrifying scene. And the scene was cut out.
It was cut out in the black communities.
In the black communities, and the black communities raised hell about it. And the scene was reinserted. In any case, I saw the scene. Whether I saw it downtown or uptown, I don't remember. But then she became a kind of heroine, because of that one scene. The boy is very, very good. The Ernest Anderson who plays the chauffeur, and Hattie McDaniels plays his mother. And a certain kind of truth, which is very rare in the American cinema, even then, especially interracial truth, was very vivid in that scene, and very explosive in that scene.
Yes.
So that, well, how can I put that? She became a kind of heroine, which is not the point. But the point for me was that I saw that something could be done. I'm still talking about myself when I was very, very young.
Yeah.
That I was not the only person to suspect what was going on in this country, and I was not simply, as I thought then, perhaps going mad, as my father was going mad under the terrible pressure of the unspoken. The terrible pressure of living a life which is not corroborated anywhere.
But there was this teacher you had. You go to Bill Miller, this teacher woman. She wanted to teach you. She was aware of things. She became an outsider herself.
Oh, she was an outsider, baby. She was a substitute teacher, actually, at that time in New York. She was very, very young. She was very important to me. I was a bookworm, too, you see, and the oldest of all these children who kept coming every summer. So I was a very strange little boy and very lonely, and read all the time. And I think I was reading Dickens when she met me. And so she started giving me books, and talking to me.
Yes.
I was about 10 years old when I met her, 9 or 10. And gave me a kind of, she made it in some way not entirely insane that I was reading War and Peace. A 10-year-old kid reading War and Peace is obviously, obviously something's wrong with him, But there was a reality in those books, which in a way she taught me to trust.
And so remember, in the last conversation 15 years ago, maybe a little later, you spoke in one of those, when you read Crime and Punishment, and you read Dostoevsky, suddenly you felt you're all alone. That is, no one felt as you did. And when you read that, there was someone else who felt as you did, and you felt liberated at that
That's
moment.
Right. I felt liberated to begin to try to find out whatever it was I was trying to find out, to live my life, to pursue whatever it was that was. I had no choice about it. I saw or sensed something which I could not explain to anybody, except to Bill Miller.
Yes.
And I didn't have to explain it to her. She understood something without my being able to say it.
And then there was the effect of the film Tale of Two Cities on you. And here there was mob scene must have had an effect to you as...
That was very strange because a 10-year-old boy cannot articulate anything really, But I had read A Tale of Two Cities. I read it over and over and over again. And I was both fascinated and appalled by the revolution. I understood it on one level, and on another level I was frightened of it. But in any case, by this time a white mob was a very terrifying thing. Because I knew by this time something about the Scottsboro case. I had already been beaten up by the cops myself. I used to pay my father's union dues downtown. So that the revolution in A Tale of Two Cities, though I felt, I wanted to overturn things and lop off heads and be revenged, in short. Still, in the very same way I was being dimly aware of Marxism, of the Communist Party in any case, I didn't see any place in it for me. It didn't seem to me that the mob would ever rise to liberate me, which meant that I would have to rise one day to liberate myself. And of course, at that point, at that age, your mind simply finds itself in an absolute, in such a contradiction that you become paralyzed. You don't quite know. You don't dare think further.
Yes.
You don't dare think further.
Yeah, there was Madame Defarge, who had Madame Defarge in Tale of Two Cities, who became very violent. But she was a sister of a murdered boy by the royalists, the revolution, and she wanted to avenge. And so her husband says, "Don't," and she says, "Then tell the wind and fire where to stop. Don't tell me." And you thought of Uncle Tom, the opposite of her.
Yeah, I thought of Uncle Tom exactly. You can see I was a very bewildered child. Because Uncle Tom's Cabin, which I read over and over and over again, frightened me in another way. It frightened me because I didn't want to become Uncle Tom. And I was too young to realize. I was really too young to know exactly what slavery meant. It was, no one ever talked about it. I was too young to realize that my father, though I knew this, knew that my father was the son of a slave, and I knew my grandmother, who died in our house when I was very young, and she had been born in slavery. Now that was an abstraction. In fact, she was my grandmother, and the fact she had been born in slavery was something which I knew, but I could not do anything with it.
Yes.
I had absolutely no image for that.
Yeah.
Uncle Tom's refusal to take vengeance into his own hands obscured the fact that, in fact, he died because he wouldn't give away the road taken by runaway slave. But again, the word slave rose like a wall in my mind.
Yes.
What does that mean exactly? And does that mean that I myself, I was the grandson of a slave? Yes. And it was very hard for me I had to become a slave myself, in fact. I had to, finally when I left home when I was 17 and started working for the railroad in New Jersey. And then, because I was working with people from Georgia, from Alabama, from Mississippi, Southerners, white Southerners, I knew about white Southerners, again, as an abstraction. But I was a Harlem boy. I'm a street boy. And so it never occurred to me that anybody would ever look at me and call me a nigger, not twice. You must be kidding. Of course, they thought I was crazy, and they did their best to kill me. And then I began to understand something which I could not have understood at 10.
And here are the films again. We come to the film, and I remember this film in the 30s. It was They Won't Forget.
Yes, I
It's
remember
the film
that.
about a lynching. It was a famous trial based on the trial of Frank, a kid in Atlanta, a Jewish kid. The actuality.
Yeah. It was based on a novel called Death in the Deep South by Ward Green.
Yeah, but you saw it.
I understood that black janitor, who was perhaps the figure and the white senator, played by Claude Rains. But the black janitor who was first blamed for the crime, or thinks he will be blamed for the crime, scared me, but I recognized that. I recognized in some mysterious way, which I suppose makes sense when you think about it. I saw my father. I did not know then what my father went through on his working day. A kid does not know that. But I knew he was going through something because of what happened when he came home. I knew that, I used to watch my mother pack his lunches. He would leave the house early in the morning, around 6:30, dressed in black, like a preacher, with a black derby, with his lunchbox in his hand, to go downtown, to go to a factory on Long Island, in fact, I think a ginger ale factory called Burke's, where he worked all day. And of course he wasn't working in his black suit and his derby, and put all that back on when he came home. And of course I didn't understand it, and my father and I did not get along very well. And yet, something about his pride and his anguish came through to me even then. And perhaps I held myself outside of it because it frightened me, because I couldn't understand it. But it was his pain. It was his pain that I saw in the man's face on the screen. Much more than the fear, the anguish.
And, of course, the film that is revived so often on TV, we see it, a remarkable film, yet a certain flaw in it, Oxbow Incident, dealing again with a lynching.
Well, the reason I like They Won't Forget is because it is icy. The politician decides very coldly to frame the white northern school teacher for this crime in order to be reelected. He frames him for the crime. The man is lynched, and he is reelected, which is exactly the way I can see that's the way that happens. In the Oxbow Incident, after the lynching, is rather maudlin letter read to this mob. But this time I knew a lot about mobs without knowing I knew it. And I knew the reading of a letter would, first of all, not bring back the dead. And also, mobs don't change.
See, at that bar, I remember saying, I loved Oxbow Incident till that last scene.
I didn't believe it.
At the bar, Henry Fonda. We'll ask you about Fonda in a minute.
Yeah.
And how black people look on Fonda and Sylvia Sidney.
Yeah.
But at that scene, he read and everybody was so sad, and suddenly
So
they're
chastened.
redeemed and chastened. The ones who were violent and lynching these three men.
I didn't believe a word of it.
I didn't either.
No.
And so we come to something very interesting. What I thought, funny. Oh, let's talk about Fonda now. He and Sylvia Sidney were like Betty Davis in a way, too, weren't they?
But Davis was another category altogether. She was funky in a kind of even sexual level. And it was her defiance and something indefinable about her style. And she wasn't pretty. That had something to do with it, too. But Sylvia Sidney, for example, in things like Street Scene, Dead End, You Only Live Once, Fury, she struck a tremendous chord in me because I understood that, however, especially You Only Live Once, because she was menaced.
We should just for a moment. Only once is a young guy, and that's Henry Fonda, who's being sought by the police, and they're going to kill him, and he's a fugitive, and she's his girl.
That's right.
And she wants to smuggle, he wants a gun, and she says, "No, you'll die."
kill
So what are they
somebody.
going to do? What are they going to do to me?
Yeah.
So you had two outcasts here.
Yes, that's right, and it was that. It was a smell of poverty. It was the sense of being menaced. It was the tremendous calculation of as to how to outwit the menace. Something in her face. Something. Again, funky, something which I recognized in any case, which is not in Carole Lombard, for example. It was not in Robert Taylor. It was not in Greta Garbo, any of those people.
She was vulnerable.
She was vulnerable.
Yeah.
And the vulnerability, the image of the vulnerability, was what I responded to, because though I wouldn't have put it that way myself then, I couldn't have put it that way myself then, I too was already exposed and vulnerable on those streets where I was selling shopping bags and shiny shoes and outwitting the cops, really.
Yes. Well, since you mentioned cops, there's a film, a socially conscious film from the play by Elmer Rice called Dead End. And here you found a remarkable flaw in Dead End, dealing with the slums of New York.
Yeah, well, I was involved with the hero who, I forget the plot exactly, but in any case...
They're looking for a gangster named Babyface Martin, and the hero is a young architect.
A young architect who
limps.
who limps, that's right. I think his name is Gimpy. I'm not
Gimpy,
sure.
That's right.
But anyway, the convolution of the plot is that effectively he turns in the gangster, and he gets the reward money. Now, the script does not assume that he turned in the gangster for the reward money, but of course I can only draw that conclusion because in my streets, which are full of Babyface Martins, sometimes called Reverend Babyface Martin, still it never occurred to us to turn anybody into the cops. The situation has changed to some extent now, for other reasons which we can go into later. But in those days, when I was growing up in the 30s, it was something that no one, if you did it, you were simply a pariah. So, it simply seemed to me that the movie was about, how to become an American success, the price of becoming an American success, because obviously with the reward money, he's going to take his girl out of the ghetto, and then he's going to be just like everybody else.
But by being an informer.
Being an informer.
Yeah. But before we take a slight break here, there's one other film, and that interests me too, done by the German director who had come here, escaped Hitler, Fritz Lang, Fury, which dealt with a lynching, an almost lynching.
An almost lynching. That was a very uneven film, but the most vivid thing in that film to me is the process by which the people turn themselves into a mob. The hearsay, the ego trips, the self-righteousness, all of which mask a terror.
There's something you mentioned in your book, this book, Devil's Work, that hit me. How they turn to the violence of aimlessness.
Yes.
The violence of aimlessness.
That's right. Because people this is what's terrifying about my country today too. It's a kind of you sense it in every city in this country, a kind of bewildered aimlessness because something has gone wrong. And no one quite knows what it is that has gone wrong. No one is quite able to take any responsibility for it. And they feel their safety being drained away from them. What they took as their safety. And out of bewilderment, and the bewilderment which paralyzes, they are becoming aimless. And an aimless people are able to do anything at all and justify it.
And find the scapegoat.
Yes.
Find the scapegoat and this was in a sense Fury. So we're talking to James Baldwin, in his new book, and it's a very perceptive. It's really film criticism, but more than that, it's an observation, life in our society through these films you saw. The Devil Finds Work, Dial the Publishers, and we'll return in a moment after this message to James Baldwin. We're resuming the conversation with Jimmy Baldwin and films. And of course, when you were a kid, you saw D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation.
Birth of a Nation. I didn't see that actually when I was a kid, or if I did, I blotted it out. I did see it once in New York when I was quite a young man, but I saw the cut version. In doing this book, I saw the uncut version, and it was a great revelation to me. First of all, I saw it. I saw it the same day I saw Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which was
Why not connect?
a mistake.
Yeah, it was interesting.
But the Birth of a Nation, which has always been hailed as as a tremendous American cinema classic, and which it is, in a way.
Technically.
You know, technically it is. No one has ever discussed the fact that it is really, I try to say in the book, it really is an elaborate justification of mass murder. You know, it is, after all, about the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which I can hardly look upon with rejoicing.
Klansman as hero.
The Klansman is hero. That he is the hero, and the whole point of the film is the unbelievable folly which overtook the country when it first of all set free the slaves, and then allowed them to enter the halls of Congress. There's a terrifying sequence in The Birth of a Nation, in the uncut version, where you see the black congressmen in the halls of the previously all-white Congress, and they are really out of their skulls. You know, fried chicken and pork chops.
So this
and
was the
watermelon.
put down of Reconstruction.
It was
of course.
It was absolutely, you know, just. There's no word for it.
Yes.
A slander is too weak a word.
But what's interesting is mulatto. There were these mulatto villains.
Yes.
And the word mulatto, you point out, comes from the word mule,
That's right.
which also involves sterility.
A hybrid.
Hybrid.
A sterile, usually a sterile
A
hybrid.
sterile hybrid.
And it occurred to me as being very revelatory and something I don't think I really have the courage to pursue. But it's a very strange, it has to be a very strange state of mind which permits or condemns a man to produce a child and then himself define his own child as sterile. It argues some kind of a spiritual panic of such depth that I don't think anyone has the courage really to pursue that. But just the same, that is part of American history, you know. It may be indeed part of Western history, but I will not go that far. It's part of American history that for generation upon generation, white people produced children on the bodies of black women whom they then repudiated and who they condemned to sterility. I don't know what that means, you know. It says something terrible about
Something incredible, of course.
the man's
body.
relationship to himself
Yes.
and to his own body.
Why self-contempt here, too.
A terrifying self-contempt.
Yes. But now we come to Leaf's films again, and generations have passed, and a seemingly enlightened filmmaker, Stanley Kramer, comes along. And the two, you saw Birth of, and at the same time you saw, we'll jump
Guess
a bit.
Who's Coming to Dinner?
Guess Who's Coming to Dinner with Sidney Poitier and Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn.
And in The Birth of a Nation, there is the absolutely familiar figure who seems to be indispensable to white self-esteem, the loyal nigger maid. And in The Birth of a Nation, the Negro congressman come to town with the carpetbaggers and so forth. She, at one point, informs the nigger congressman that she does not approve of black people who put themselves up above their station. I saw the film in the morning. I saw Guess Who's Coming to Dinner in the afternoon. And when The Wonder Doctor hit San Francisco, more than 50 years later, working for Mr. Tracy and Miss Hepburn is a lawyer, a nigger maid, who informs the Wonder Doctor in almost exactly the same language that she does not approve of black people or niggers
Now
put
this
themselves up
doctor-
above their station.
This doctor, played by Sidney Poitier, is very distinguished. He's going to marry the daughter of... Now, we know right off the bat that Spencer Tracy and two very enlightened people. We know it's going to work out to begin
Of
with.
course.
But and he's not going to live in San Francisco. They're going to go to Europe.
Or the Middle East or someplace. You know.
And you got this incredible scene where his parents, the mothers understand, but the father, the doctor's father,
doesn't understand at all. But that's a fascinating scene to me because in the beginning we are absolutely overwhelmed by the Wonder Doctor's record, which is absolutely inconceivable for anyone 37 in any case. However, leaving that aside, he is at the summit of ambition. He is a world famous man. But in the scene between the father and the son, which near the end of the film forgets all these grandiose assumptions entirely and treats poor Wonder Doctor like anybody's handyman. Because it's inconceivable that the father, or the mother for that matter, in the first place, they are the mother and father of this prodigy. And they have, therefore, a weapon against the white family, which is, they'll be far from overwhelmed by that white family, and the only reservation about the marriage might be, that the daughter was not good enough for their son. But all the other assumptions on which the film operates would not be theirs at all, And the father knows perfectly well that his son is not going to stay in San Francisco, And if his son wants to marry this girl and take her off to China or someplace, why not?
Yeah.
The father has spent all of his life trying to, in some way, set his son free.
You really have what seemed to be an enlightened film, a fantasy situation at best.
A fantasy situation which is very, very dangerous when you really try to examine it, because a whole lot of white people, or people who think of themselves as white, will believe this fantasy because they want to, and then try to act on it with predictable and dangerous and terrifying results.
Yes.
It is in short a kind of insult to and I'm not, I've got nothing against Mr. Kramer at all, who in fact I rather admire him.
He means well, of course.
And it's, he's at the mercy of a misapprehension, which is the misapprehension of the country.
So we come to a prior film, and this, of course, is very memorable. Not so much the film as the reactions, because we talked about this 15 years ago.
That's true.
It was The Defiant Ones, with Sidney Poitier and Tony Curtis, and the two convicts in the South, black and white, chained and the escape. Now, you've got to recount the scene as was seen by a Harlem audience and it was seen by a white audience, a key scene.
Well, I went to see the film all those years ago, the first time. And I saw it, and I went to see it because everyone, said I should see it, and it was, a very admirable and very important breakthrough for black people in this country. So I went to see it. I saw it downtown. And the moment comes when Sidney jumps off the train to be with Tony Curtis, and everybody in the audience downtown was very, very moved by that. I was not. I was dimly disturbed. I couldn't quite put my finger on it because my own reaction at first was, why? Because it's still a Jim Crow chain gang, and leaving aside, the characterization of the white cat. When I saw it uptown, what had happened to me was kind of clarified because the black audience, when Sidney jumped off the train, was absolutely furious. And I never forget the roar. They said, "Get back on the train, you fool!" And of course they were right. What in the world is he going to do down there in that chain gang with that dreary little dim-witted, and they won't even be together in any case. They're going to be breaking rock and doing all that. Separated as black and white people still are for the most part in this country. Again, it's a fantasy, which reassures white people, or reassures them of what? Because the chain gang is still there. Senator Eastland still is a very powerful man in Mississippi, not only in Mississippi, in this country. People still take Governor Wallace very, very seriously. The labor unions, every institution in this country is still Jim Crow. And it seems to me, a kind of cowardice, finally, and a very dangerous kind of cowardice, to be reassured by so blatant a fable.
Now, and continuing in this vein about pictures that are well-meaning but turn out to be precisely the opposite is one that won all Academy Awards. I didn't see, but you have a remarkable commentary, and that's In the Heat of the Night, with Sidney Poitier and Rod Steiger.
Yeah. Well, it's a very sad film in a sense. There's something very moving about it in a very disturbing way, because the figure of the sheriff is so, and the figure, in fact, of all the white people in that curious movie, is so curiously choked, and especially the figure played by Rod Steiger, because after all, I've I've had to encounter a few Southern sheriffs, and there is that choked, inarticulate quality, which always erupts, however, in violence, of one kind or another, against his wife, against his child, and always against the nigger. There's something he cannot deal with in himself, something he cannot deal with about the life he lives, which makes him very, very dangerous. In the heat of the night, of course, he is not dangerous. He is in some way redeemed by the example given by the black detective. Now, this can happen too. One has seen that happen in life, but it never happens in that way, and it never happens without somebody paying an enormous price, for a man to change. And this is true for you, Studs, it's true for Jimmy, it's true for everybody who's ever tried to live and tried to deal with, however inadequately, the conundrum of his life.
Yes.
To move from one place to another, really to become a different human being, to see something you did not see before and act on that. It does not happen every day, and it costs you everything. If the situation in the heat of the night were viable, were true, then we would not be in the trouble in this country that we are. Those films, in fact, simply indicate the depth of the trouble without ever confronting what the trouble is.
Yes.
You see what I mean?
Yes, of course. This is never confronting it. You see, this is the point, the non-confrontation with situations. By the way, I suppose there have been changes in the South to some extent.
Oh, yes, there have been changes in the South. There have been, I'm afraid I had to put it very brutally, there have been mainly cosmetic changes. The city of Atlanta still belongs to the state of Georgia, and one can still say...
Despite the fact that Maynard Jackson is the mayor.
Yes, but he does not run the state of Georgia. And it is still true, you can still say it's true, that in the city of Atlanta, the Negro vote has a great deal of power, but it still has very little power in the state.
Yes.
Yes.
There's a reaction you have, of course. Interesting. Now we want another country, but the same situation. Lawrence in Arabia.
Yes.
And here's something interesting.
That was a strange movie. I saw it twice deliberately, not because I was so overwhelmed by it, but to study it. And then I read the book. I read T. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, and discovered something which is not, of course, in the film. It's too simple to call T. Lawrence a racist. He was... But if you anatomize the book and his attitudes, even his dubious love for the Arabs is a kind of paternalistic racism, and his real attitude toward black people is unspeakable. When he says it hurt to realize that the Negroes possess exact counterparts of all our bodies. It's an extraordinary confession.
What interests me is your observation about Britain, the role,
Oh, yes.
We are, after all, the superior people, to bring our civilization to them.
Yes.
I couldn't help but think of Vietnam and LBJ as president. That is, he would have given the Vietnamese people anything if only they would become like us.
Exactly.
And this isn't...
And that is the time of day it is, and that's what's so terrifying.
Yeah.
Because, on the other hand, the Vietnamese, for example, or the Indians, for that matter, however miserable they may be, the most terrifying thing about the situation in which we find ourselves, I think, is that we who have made a point of trying to contain communism or prevent the spread of communism, whatever that may mean, have become in that effort ourselves so utterly unattractive that we ourselves have destroyed the possible alternative. There is no one in the world now, and this has happened in the last 20 years, who wants to be like us for very, very good reasons. They want to live. And what we have done all over the world is to destroy. We have destroyed it. It wasn't done from the outside. What was once called the American dream. We have destroyed it because we ourselves have revealed that we consider things and safety to be much more important than human life.
Yes.
That is our performance.
I'll never forget a phrase you used in our previous conversation, one of them. It's, what do you think my people came here and died for and fought for? A lousy Cadillac?
Yeah.
Is the way you put it.
Yeah. Well, in that sense, Studs, all that has changed is that more and more people have begun to realize the dubious value of the Cadillac. and that perhaps one has paid too high a price for it. People are going to suspect that in this country, and certainly, wherever I've been in the world.
Yeah.
What we will do about that, I do not know. When one looks at the state of every city, and when you look at the unemployment rate, and when you realize, no matter how you cut it, the economy has never been able to support everybody in it. Niggas are still the first to be fired and the last to be hired. And I'm 51 years old now. That has not changed in my lifetime, and it probably won't change in my lifetime.
Yeah. And as you write, now you're growing up, now you're older, now you're mature, and you lived at a certain time. We go even beyond, extends from race to something else related, the McCarthy time. And you saw a movie called God Help Us, My Son John, with Helen Hayes and Anne Heflin and Robert Walker and Dean Jagger.
I saw the film in 1952 when I came home for the first time for nearly 4 years. And I've been away just long enough, to be bewildered by my country, but not long enough to be estranged from it, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And to come home in 1952, which is the height of the McCarthy era, and to watch what was happening all around me to people I knew who were mysteriously being blacklisted, and other people whom I knew who were being friendly witnesses before the House Un-American Activities Committee, people signing loyalty oaths. My position was, if I were a communist, I would sign a loyalty oath if I were a communist. But since I'm not, I won't. And it's an insult, and whether or not I'm a communist is no concern of yours. I will not answer the question. Luckily, I was too young and too obscure for anyone to question me at that point in my life. But it frightened me because the film frightened me, because the idea that your salvation, in any way, whatever, depended on informing, that your salvation could be, in any way, whatever, in the hands of the FBI, that the highest American virtue would be to turn the defector in. It frightened me because I've in the 4 years in Europe, I've met people who had been fleeing from Russia, from Germany, from Ethiopia, from Spain. I lived in Paris long enough to realize how a police state could work. I don't mean that Paris was a police state, but it could very easily be turned into one, because that's the role of the concierge in the block.
I met you there during the time of the Algerian crisis.
That's right.
Yes.
Which is eventually what drove me back, because I simply couldn't stay in France.
But this come to the climate now. There's something now that's in real life happened to you there. You met a kid, and the FBI came to see you. This kid he was a deserter of the Marines,
As it turned out. Yeah.
AWOL. But what frightens me is this moment, and you did not inform, they were looking, but a friend of yours and his turned him in casually, and the comment you made was the climate. The made for a certain amorality of betrayal of friends is an order of the day.
That's right. We are paying for that until today. I'll never forget that moment in my life. Facing this kid, I know who I've not seen for 4 years either. When he told me to turn the boy in. Now, I didn't even know the boy really, So my situation was, I was.
But he was a friend. This other guy was a friend of the boy.
He knew him. I did not. I met him. I didn't know him. All right, he was a deserter from the Marines. That happens to be his problem, his situation, and it's no part of my duty to call the cops. I'm sorry, not at all. That's something for him for him to work out himself. It's something which, that's a man's life. But the kid had turned him in because he'd been told to, really, And this is 1976. This was happening in 1952. Everyone forgets that this is the first time we heard of Richard Nixon, for example. And everyone forgets that the amorality of that time has led to the present crisis, really.
A crazy thought occurs to me. It's one of these explosive things that you like that suddenly hit you. Two things: the amorality, the climate, the aimlessness, made for this. And in Fury, the film Fury, you speak of the aimlessness that created a mob that almost lynched a man.
That's right.
And so the two are related here. The aimlessness.
This is the aimlessness of a mob which has almost destroyed a country.
Yes.
After all, the country I am old enough to be able, I can say categorically that when I was growing up in this country, it was a very different place. It really was. No matter what my battles were with it, still are. But it was not, there were options, there was some sense of human life, of human connection. Whereas now, it seems to me, in every city in any case, that everyone is afraid of everybody else, and everyone is looking for a scapegoat, someone to blame it on.
Yeah.
And in the end of the event, it turns out that we are blaming it, in effect, on the poor,
Yes.
who are mainly the blacks, the Mexicans, the Puerto Ricans.
Come again to the scapegoat, don't we?
Yes,
The
yes.
scapegoat, instead of saying what it is that makes for the...
It is not a black man's fault or a Mexican's fault or a Puerto Rican's fault if the economy cannot give him a job. I don't know anybody, and I grew up on welfare, who wants to be on welfare. It is not a human ambition, and it is criminal to blame the defection of the society on the victim.
As a screenwriter, you were commissioned to do biography, of Malcolm X.
Yes, that was a difficult time. That was a rough one. The difficulty was that, I wanted, the autobiography of Malcolm X is a book which I admire, and that I was of two minds about trying to do the screenplay, but the situation was such that I could hardly refuse. So there I was. Now, Malcolm was a street boy like me, so I know something about that. I knew him, and I loved him very much, and I had tremendous respect for him. And the crunch came in Hollywood, in a sense, at the point of Malcolm's trip to Mecca. In my interpretation of Malcolm's life, it was at that point that Malcolm made that enormous step, of which some people are capable and many are not, when he examined himself and looked at everything and made certain conclusions, and those conclusions, which involved his ceasing to be a racist, insofar as he had ever really been one, when he said that white is a state of mind, and white people are not devils, they are human, just like, and I see this now. He became, for the first time, really then a dangerous man.
Yeah, of course, this is what you wanted to get in the film, but you must recreate this one scene that's so telling, how they altered a scene that you had written. You had the collaboration of a screenwriter. This is what I call self-censorship. Is that now how the scene was altered? Malcolm comes into a bar.
This was very subtle. It taught me a lot, though. The scene is very short, very simple scene. It's hard to do because you're trying to be as understated as you can be. In any case, the scene is Malcolm in the zoot suit, of that time. Country boy, looking like a country boy, walks into Small's Paradise for the first time in the late afternoon. And in the scene is written, this is where he meets West Indian Archie for the first time. This is the man the black man who introduced him to the rackets. And Archie is sitting there with his friends, and the country boy stumbles over Archie's shoes. And Archie is struck, and his friends are struck, by something they see in Malcolm. And it's not something palpable. It isn't something you can really easily put your fingers on. But they all come from the country one way or another. They know the boy don't know where he is. They don't know what he know. They know he doesn't know what can happen to him. But they've seen it all. They know, and they have that kind of, the kind of affection, the kind of wry affection. They don't mean the kid no harm at all, Anyway,
that's the scene you wrote.
That's the scene I wrote.
Yeah.
Archie uses Malcolm stumbling over his shoes as an excuse to invite him to the table for a drink. That's the beginning of Malcolm's career as a racketeer. Well, in the scene is rewritten, Malcolm comes into the bar, and he stumbles over Archie's shoes, his $40 floor chimes. And the rewritten scene, Archie gets furious and pulls a gun, and Malcolm gets furious and pulls a gun. And everybody else sits in the bar, and they take bets on, on who's going to win. And I forget how the scene was resolved. I was in a state of despair when I read it. So, with that scene, just that one single scene, which is the single detail of the shootout, destroys everything.
Of course, here you have, now we come to the key, don't we, of the perversion of something, that in truth there was an empathy. And there's an empathy amongst people who are put upon, there can be something great happening. But to make it commercial, also to kill that idea of empathy. You have the two people slugging, fighting each other, animals, killers, great cheering.
It is
precisely the opposite
It
of
is.
what
It
can
is
be.
not. It is just not the way it happens. You know, it's not the way anybody in that bar would ever treat a country boy. In any case,
Yeah,
you know.
so we come to a version of truth, don't we?
Yes.
In,
yes. What it taught me was that the ways in which one evades without even knowing it. You know, because this wasn't done out of wicked motives. It was done out of what we call commercial motives, if you like, entertainment values, if you like. You know, to give the scene some action. But in the giving of it that kind of action, you destroyed the people. You destroyed the motive, and you destroyed. You also destroyed a way of life, because the relationship of two black people to each other involves a vast amount of shorthand. You know, involves body language, if you like. You know, involves, we both know something about where we come from, which you haven't got to speak about.
But also, in the version you had, which is close to the truth, there was the possibility, the empathy between people, the possibility of change.
That's right.
And so this was kicked out.
And this was kicked out completely. The whole relationship of black people to each other was kicked out.
Yes. You know.
So, and if you want to continue in that direction with the film, one would have had. I would simply have committed suicide. Actually.
Yes. We opened with Bessie Smith singing the blues, and you quote from a blues. More close than that blues you quote is Lead Belly singing Good Morning Blues.
Good morning blues.
Good morning, how are you? The blues is not only woke up this morning, blues around my bed, ate my breakfast, blues in my bread. And we're talking about blues in life, aren't we?
That's right. That's right. Perhaps I'm saying that when white Americans learn to sing the blues, they'll begin to be liberated from what they think they fear now.
I like that. I like that idea. The Devil Finds Work. Dial Publishers. Jimmy Baldwin, my guest once again. What a delight to meet you again. And
I was glad to see you.
I'll see you again very soon. And here is Lead Belly and Good Morning Blues.
Welcome to the Studs Terkel Almanac. The Almanac features the weekly best of the interviews, short stories, documentaries, and music programs from Studs' daily Chicago broadcasts. Today, Studs speaks with James Baldwin. Now, here's Studs.
July 15th, 1961, 24 years ago and several months. First I met James Baldwin. We had our conversation. 24 years have passed, and the obvious question is, what has changed? There have been changes, of course. What has changed, certainly as far as black-white relationship in the United States, for that matter, in the world. And James Baldwin's new book is called The Evidence of Things Not Seen. It's a quote from Paul. It's published by Holt Reinhardt Winston. And it's his reflections on the Atlanta child killing case several years ago. Wayne Williams, you recall, was convicted of it in Atlanta. And it's Jimmy Baldwin's reflections. In fact, that almost becomes the metaphor. And I thought, as an experiment, Jimmy, you're here now after some 24 years. We sit across the microphone looking at each other. And we've seen each other a couple of times since, because that first meeting was so indelible to me. You had been in Europe. You had left the country. You had been to Switzerland, lived for a while. And as I recall the opening, there's a Bessie Smith recording. And your thoughts on hearing Bessie. So we'll hear the Bessie Smith, part of her Downhearted Blues, and then your voice of 21 years ago at that moment on hearing it.
That winter in Switzerland, I was working on my first novel, which I thought I would never be able to finish. And I finally realized in Europe that one of the reasons that I couldn't finish this novel was because I was ashamed of where I'd come from and where I'd been, and ashamed of the life in the church, and ashamed of my father. Ashamed of the blues, and ashamed of jazz, and of course ashamed of watermelon, because it was, all of these stereotypes that the country inflicts on Negroes, that we all eat watermelon, or we all do nothing but sing the blues and all that. Well, I was afraid of all that, and I ran from it. And when I say I was trying to dig back to the way I myself must have spoken when I was little, I realized that I had acquired so many affectations, I had told myself so many lies, that I really had buried myself beneath a whole fantastic image of myself which wasn't mine, but white people's image of me. And I realized that I had not always talked, obviously I hadn't always talked the way I had forced myself to learn how to talk. And I had to find out what I had been like in the beginning. In order, just technically then, to recreate Negro speech, I realized it was a cadence, it was a beat, much more than, it was not a question of dropping S's or N's or G's, but a question of the beat, really. And Bessie had the beat, you know. And in that, this icy wilderness, you know, as far removed from Harlem as anything you can imagine, with Bessie Smith and me, I began
And white snow.
And white snow, and white mountains, and white faces, who really thought I was...
And so now, 24 years later, you see today, you recall that. Why not continue? 24 years later now. So it was hearing Bessie Smith in white-snowed Switzerland.
Yes. All those alabaster people. It's very hard for me to begin to be articulate about, you know, I didn't realize until I walked in this room that it's been 24 years. I had not forgotten exactly, you know, but how can I put it? It's a quarter of a century we're talking about.
Mm.
And I don't know how to, I can't find a perspective on it. You were asking me before
Listen, what's
how much has
happened.
changed.
In that quarter of a century, Martin Luther King lived, was celebrated, and died. Malcolm X lived, less celebrated, but celebrated, and died. The Civil Rights Act passed, changes, and yet. And so, what has happened as you see it? Now we come, of course, to the Atlanta case you went down to observe and reflect on.
Listening to myself, listening to you, listening to Bessie, what struck me, but I don't mean to be sardonic, is one of the things that has certainly changed is whatever it means, is the language. I was saying Negroes then, now we say blacks. And that has something to do with, I repeat, I'm not trying to be sardonic, but listening to that word in my voice then, and I thought back to my father, who was from New Orleans, the son of a slave, and his word for us was black, and which is not a term that black people used then. We were Negroes or we were colored. There was a great deal of trouble trying to find a word to describe oneself. Negro, colored, there was a moment we called ourselves race people, whatever that meant. But that has something to do, you know, what strikes me with great force is it has something to do with the tremendous conundrum of trying to define oneself in a hostile territory, but not only hostile. It would be one thing if I were a stranger here. I'm not a stranger here, and yet I have always had to redefine myself perpetually in order to overcome, to get beyond, to surpass the brutal definitions which until this hour my countrymen apply to black people as we now call ourselves. And in that effort to define oneself, somewhere in that is contained the American possibility and the American dilemma. You know, it is, every generation has had to redefine itself, and the redefinition has been dictated by the necessity to get beyond the brutal definitions which your country imposes on you. And that has not changed in a quarter of a century.
So brings us to the case. You were sent down by a magazine. It was Playboy, and you were sent down to see the case. And here you come to Atlanta, and eventually a young black man, rather gifted and interesting one, is convicted. He was convicted of the slaying of 2 adults.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking of 28 dead people, 26 of whom were children.
That's right.
Black. And that has interested you.
Well, it struck me, you know, I got there after the case was closed, or it was on appeal. But Wayne had already been arrested, and...
Wayne Williams.
Wayne Williams had been arrested, and the case was closed. Well, the case was closed officially, but it was very clear to me that it wasn't closed in the minds and hearts of the people in the streets. You know, I was, after all, as a reporter. And as a reporter, you know, you know better than I do. You talk to everyone who will talk to you. Taxi drivers, bartenders, maids, loose ladies, cops, everybody, you know. And it was their reaction which most disturbed me in a sense. You know, some people really wanted to believe that Wayne Williams was guilty. And I began to realize that I, too, would have liked to believe it. It would have made it easier. But it was impossible to overlook the case. You cannot, it's very difficult to, it's a very strange legal precedent to arrest a man for murdering two grown people and then connect him via a theory of a pattern to the murder of 26 or 28 children. You know, the evidence for the two murders was far from conclusive, and the evidence that he had murdered the children really had to be taken, well, it wasn't proven. It had to be taken on faith. I had to make an effort. I went to several sites, for example. I went 7 or 8. I must tell you, that does something to your mind too. I began to think I was about to go crazy. I was about to go mad because the death of anybody is that the murder is a horrible thing, but the murder of children is especially horrible. And to try to imagine what was going on in the mind of the child, try to imagine who in the world could possibly be going around throwing children, strangling them, or whatever, and then throwing them on the highway, throwing them in the river, throwing them on a bridge, leaving them alone, leaving them as though they were garbage by the side of the road. That drove me a little mad, but it meant I had to really look at the case. And I could not. There was no way. I did not believe I couldn't find the pattern that the DA talked about at all. I didn't identify anyone else to find that pattern. And I was not convinced by the overwhelming weight of fiber evidence, which has never been used in a murder case.
Fiber evidence.
Fiber evidence.
Similar fiber.
Yes.
In the
and
car.
as far as, fibers found on the children, fibers found in the house, fibers found in the car.
And the fiber that fits the carpet in his house.
Principally that. But there were something, I forget how many pieces of fiber evidence, in the case. Well, if I've understood fiber evidence, it can prove that you and I'm not even certain you can prove this, but it can prove perhaps that you and I have been in the same environment at some point. It cannot prove that we've been in the same environment together. It cannot prove that I've ever met you. And it certainly cannot prove I murdered you. You see what I mean? So it seemed to me that what was happening was not so much, it was a murder case indeed, but it was also, it put the black community, put it to you this way then, it put the black community in a very peculiar position, because if the black community agreed, then we were risking a very dangerous kind of collusion, it seemed to me, And it was very clear to me that the case itself had been opened and was closed by, not the city of Atlanta, but by the state of Georgia. And this, I think, created an interesting and a kind of terrifying precedent. And all I want to do in the book is ask you, the reader, to look over the case with me. I'm not, after all, obliged, and neither are you, to prove the convicted innocent or guilty. But we do have the obligation to observe whether or not the state has proven him guilty.
The case was merely, you covered the case, but merely it was a catapult for your reflections to the condition generally.
Yeah, well, in a sense, my reflections on what indeed has happened in the last 25 years. You mentioned Martin, you mentioned Malcolm. I think of Medgar. I think of all those kids, boys and girls, going, braving armies and National Guardsmen and hoses and bombs, and they're co-citizens. In fact, you mentioned Martin and Malcolm, and JFK and his brother also went. Carried away by the climate of violence which we allowed in this country, which we allowed to overtake this country. It would seem that my co-citizens imagined that the violence would only attack black people. But as I was trying to say then, and we're repeating it now, a plague is no respecter of delusions, and once that violence is unleashed in any society, nobody in the society is safe. This society is still struggling to with the infantile question of whether or not a black person is a human being. And that is a very, very, very dangerous distraction as we approach the end of the 20th century.
But the case, we go back and forth. The case had a black judge. You mentioned, before that, you said Atlanta didn't end the case. Georgia did.
Mm-hmm.
And you find Atlanta itself considered itself not quite Georgia.
I'm from Atlanta, not from Georgia. Yes, that's the...
Meaning what?
It took me years to try to figure out exactly what that meant. After all, I went there for the first time in 1957. And I could see when I look back, I could see then too. For example, in the 50s when we were all there, testing the law, trying to get signs to come down, trying to desegregate the country. You and I, for example, you white, me black, would try to get arrested for sitting in front of the bus together. And the mayor of Atlanta would never arrest us. He did not want any of those cases to come into court. And if you remember, there was
that
a virtually...
Hartsfield, wasn't it? Was that Hartsfield?
That was Hartsfield, I think, yes. But there were very, very few test cases, almost none. Only one manifestation led by Martin, while all the rest of the South was, the cities all over the South were in ferment, were blowing up. But Atlanta was relatively tranquil, partly because it already had enough trouble being not only with Martin Luther King Jr., but also with his father in Ebenezer Baptist Church. And they had to, they did everything in their power to keep the lid on. But the governor of Georgia, on the other hand, wanted every single one of us on the chain gang. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. It was that kind of tension between the city and the state, which according to me is still there. And that's why people mean they say I'm from Atlanta. I'm not from Georgia. Yeah. But Atlanta belongs to Georgia.
Yeah. But here then the case in Atlanta. And one of the ironies of the case is that the judge, Clarence Cooper, was black. The mayor, Maynard Jackson at the time, I believe.
That's right.
Pre-Andrew Young. You have an interesting portrait of Andrew Young, who also knew Wayne Williams as a kid.
That's right.
So we have interesting, crazy juxtapositions. Lee Brown, the police chief.
That's right. He was a very nice man.
So we have a crazy irony here, don't we?
We have a crazy irony, a dangerous irony, but it is also, it seems to me, it seems to me that the irony we're looking at is the black-white American situation in some relief. Because it is very true, after all. It is. The older I get, the more I'm convinced that the most dangerous delusion this country has is that it's white. And when the chips are down, and especially in the South, no one can be certain. No one can prove he's white. Nobody would dare to try to prove it. And I know that my ancestors are both black and white, and so does everybody else know that. And in the deep South, where race became a kind of absolute paranoia, the question of who murdered the children began to be a terrifying question for everyone in the community, because nobody, I have relatives after all, who are as pale as you. And my grandmother, who was a slave, had 14 children. And some of them came out of her womb looking like you, and some of them came out of her womb looking like me.
As you put it, we were more than kissing cousins.
Yeah, much more than kissing cousins. And everybody knows it. The dilemma, the horror is that everyone denies it. Not everyone denies it, but the country denies it. And that has led us to a very strange place. And that meant that the case of the murdered children in Atlanta, really, whether or not one wished to believe it, implicated everybody.
And so you speak of the paranoid color wheel. The paranoid color wheel. Something goes round and round.
That's right.
And you have the mother of one of the child victims, Camille Bell, who becomes a member of the defense of the six.
She turned herself into a one-woman defense committee for the parents of the accused. And last week, I had to go through Atlanta very, very, like a dose of salt, actually, because the lawyers, Bill Consular and, Lynn Watley was the lawyer I was working with when I was down there, the black lawyer, has been joined by William Consular and Consular's two associates, whose names I don't remember, to reopen the case. And I did not really, exactly want to be in Atlanta, but I had to be there because of the book, really. And what struck me, my brother came with me, and he said, I was very tense, and it was Writing that book was very painful for me. Anyway, there were 9 of the mothers were there, along with Homer Williams. And David said, now, look, he said, if they believed for a moment that Homer Williams was the father of the murder of their children, they would not be here. And they've been working together ever since the case was closed to try to get it open. You see what I mean? So that I was confronted, I'm saying I was confronted with 2 verdicts. One, the official verdict, and the other one in the streets, summed up by Camille Bell, in fact, And that was very troublesome.
So you find the black people of Atlanta not really believing that he was convicted of the murder of the 2 drifters, but as far as the 26 children are concerned.
The people don't believe that.
They don't believe that.
No, they don't believe that. They never did believe it. And they never will. Which is why, according to me, I didn't write the book I wrote the book just to do what I said, to make you look at it with me. But it's why the case should be reopened, because the parents are the children. Who, after all,
faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. St. Paul used that as an epigraph in the book. That's the title of the book. That's what you're talking about. Evidence of things not seen.
It's a rather chilling epigraph. Because what I'm trying to suggest to my reader, and therefore absolutely, after all, to my country, I say faith is the substance of things hoped for, and I'm using it in a rather ironical way because part of the American faith has been in my inferiority. And somewhere, years and years and years ago, I said that the South and the nation have been successful in one thing, at least, which is that they managed to create, I said, in every generation, only that Negro they wanted to see. That is the substance of things hoped for. And the evidence of things not seen is the resistance precisely on the part of I, as a black cat, my resistance, historically and actually, my absolutely necessary resistance against your definition. I am not what you say I am. My father was not what the American Republic said he was. There's no way for a black American to accept these definitions without, in fact, becoming the substance of things hoped for.
And so just as 24 years ago you wrote the series of essays, Nobody Knows My Name, it's still the case. Nobody knows, or maybe a few know your name, but not very many.
Not very many, no.
We'll come back to that again, don't we?
Yeah, and you see the problem is what breaks my heart, in fact, is that people until this hour are talking about America as though it has a black problem, the Negro problem, the black problem. But it would be interesting, it would be salutary, if only for a week, one simply changed the vocabulary and talked about a white problem. Because I don't have a problem, as a black person, I don't have a problem dealing with white people. I don't have a problem, I have the problems everyone has getting through, a single day. But I don't wake up in the morning and go to bed at night, thinking about white people. But I have a peculiar role in the American imagination.
As you say that, I'm looking, it's funny, just as you said that, I came across page 81 of James Baldwin's book, The Evidence of Things Not Seen. Neither the Europeans nor the Americans are able to recognize that they mercilessly enslaved each other before they attempted a passage to India, a hoisted sail for Africa. And all that has united Europe as Europe, or Europe and America until today, is not the color white, but what they perceive as the color black. They do not care about each other at all. Never have, and it's conceivably ever will. The English treat the Irish and the Scottish, for example, like dogs. And they treat each other the same way. To open your mouth in England is hazardous. Not to be arrested to open your mouth, but your accent reveals your origins, and thus we come to class and accent, and therefore your human value.
Well,
And
that's
so
true, isn't it?
This is what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm talking about that. I wish, well, I'm older now than I was, and a lot of things have changed. People change in strange ways. The changes don't ever result in the changes you thought. And I suppose what I'm trying to confront now, I'm approaching the last act of my life, I suppose, is that, for example, when Martin was murdered, I, like many other people, underwent a kind of devastation. I couldn't. It took me a while to begin to write again. I didn't see what purpose it served. On the other hand, Martin hadn't stopped, so I couldn't. But I didn't know how to start again. Well, I was forced to realize that what had happened, and I was different in any case. I was not different the way I thought I would be different, but I was different. I was different because I had to undergo it. And then I began to realize that was true for everyone who underwent that, white or black. Because the terms, you see, as the older I get, the more exasperating the terms become, because they don't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything to be white. It doesn't mean anything to be black. It means something to try to become a human being. It means something to try to create a country, to create a society in which people can live, white and black. Because if I can't live in this society, neither can you. What is happening to my children is also happening to yours. And your children and my children are equally sacred. It is a crime not to know that. That is what, this kind of rough folk wisdom I finally come to in a way, it is not going to happen the way you thought it would. It's not going to happen in your lifetime that way. What has happened in the intervening time is that we thought of, perceived then, as simply a domestic problem, which could be resolved within the continental limits of the United States, is now a global problem. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And we are watching in Johannesburg, South Africa, for example, the bloody culmination of the idea of white supremacy and the peculiar Western notion that in order to civilize a man, you make him a slave. The reality, finally, escapes one's definitions. When one has got to deal with that, and perhaps the whole point of the struggle is to force yourself to be enabled again and again and again to confront the necessity within every human being to change, to move, to understand that you can hold on to nothing. And the past is only useful insofar as you can tell the truth about it and use it.
As you're talking, I was thinking of something else I found here. This is a question of images. How one image connects to another, and somehow there may be a link here. Seeming some of these kids' bodies were found in the river, were they not? And then, quoting from James Baldwin's book, Evidence of Things Not Seen. Some years ago, after the disappearance of civil rights workers Shaney, Goodman, and Schwerner in Philadelphia, Mississippi, some friends of mine were dragging the river for their bodies before they were found in the dug graves. This one wasn't Schwerner, this one wasn't Goodman, this one wasn't Cheney. Then, as Dave Dennis tells it, it suddenly struck us, what difference did it make if it wasn't them? What are these bodies doing in the river? Mm-hmm. And so while looking for the 3 civil rights workers, they found bodies of other blacks in the river.
What are these bodies doing in the river?
So that raises a whole question that's beyond
the
Atlanta case.
Much beyond the Atlanta case. The Atlanta case is simply a symptom of something, And I want to make, after all, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to bear witness to a country which I believe in, a country which has got to be brought into being somehow, which will be brought into being in any case, with our consent or without it. But unless we can ask those questions, we're in great trouble. What are those bodies doing in the river? And that question applies to everybody. It is everyone's responsibility.
And so the great many black people of Atlanta don't believe that Wayne Williams, though convicted of the 2 drifters, did the kids in, because there's a whole history here. Mm-hmm. And yet, some would say, as far as we know, the killings of the children at least has stopped. Suppose if that question is asked you, what's your reply?
In the first place, nobody can prove it.
Nobody proves it.
And you can't. If you say that, then you have to say that the runaway children have stopped. It is not a conceivable answer. It's not a conceivable answer. There's no guarantee that the murders have stopped. The murders going on, and Wayne was still in prison. enough for him to be worried, I was told, that he might be accused of some of those. And again, I'm speaking with the authority of the people of Atlanta, the people who talk to me.
I was thinking, let's just keep this free as we're doing it, free, because I realize free association is so much part of your book. Come to that. Wayne Williams himself, you found a fascinating. Wayne Williams, he was someone obviously gifted, was he not?
He was a gifted gifted adolescent. That's how Andrew Young met him, when he and his friends were running an illegal radio station out of Wayne's basement. He was precocious. He was, according to the legend, precocious. To some people, obnoxious. But I can see that a 15-year-old kid could be obnoxious. We all are at 15 in one way or another obnoxious. But of course, I was watching him the way you were watching him. You were watching him on the witness stand, which I try to indicate in the book. And you're watching someone in the witness stand. You're watching a whole series of other reflexes in you and in the person. Especially if he's accused of being a mass murderer.
And you don't believe he did it because there was a certain arrogance there. Mm-hmm. And a certain, you used the word indolent. There's a certain that he was beyond doing something like this.
That. No, it would be beneath him. It was
beneath him.
It would be beneath him. He would never think of that. He doesn't seem to me to have that kind of single-minded, whatever it is. Then you're lost. What does it take to make a man murder children? But I'm convinced that he didn't do that. It is not his. I think he would consider it beneath him, and I think he's right. I think he was a spoiled kid. Even his parents admit that, and everyone who had dealings with him says that. But a spoiled brat is just a spoiled brat. Doesn't mean he's a pathological murderer. The amount of energy and planning, the amount of the convolutions one will have to go through to accomplish the crimes of which he is accused seem to me to be quite beyond him.
The boy seemed to be possessed, quoting Baldwin, by a blind, invalid arrogance, and every human being, as his eyes flicked over or flinched against them, became immediately as malleable as his mother and his father. This is the reason, as I have said, that I really do not believe him guilty. He is far, far too indolent. I do not believe that for him other people are sufficiently real to elicit anything so dangerous as passion. Mm-hmm. Passion may be the province of nightmares, but it's far from the land of dreams. William struck me as a spoiled, lost, and vindictive child, sheltered somehow from the storm of puberty, for whom others exist only as a means of proving his power to manipulate. Mm-hmm. So manipulate is something different from murder. So
it's a curious kind of thing. It's a curious kind of scapegoat. And what interests me, of course, is that what terrifies me is our situation in this strange place, in this strange land. I suppose at bottom what I was most worried about was I don't want the black people of this country, or the non-white people of this country, to become collaborators in their own destruction. You know what I mean? It is a matter. You see, it's always been here. Insofar, this one has to put it very brutally. But insofar as a black man, particularly a black man, insists on being that, he endangers the attitudes and the legends of our country. A free nigger is still at the very bottom of the popular mind. A bad nigger. I hate to say that, but it's still true. And the nature of the trap is that one does everything in one's power. I've done everything in my power. So did my father, so does my brother, so does my nephew. Everything to, as it were, pass unnoticed, and not to be penalized for the color of your skin or the history written in the color of your skin according to other people. And there has been no way until this hour, in the generality, for the general American conscience or consciousness to accept their former slave as a human being. And tries all kinds of strategies. There was Malcolm on the one hand, there was Martin on the other. Both of them were men. They were both driven. I watched them both being driven by the pressures under which they operated, closer and closer together, you know. And I don't mean that Martin became a racist or that Malcolm became a Christian, but they both, Malcolm in fact ceased being a racist, which is when he became dangerous, you know. And Malcolm and Martin had to unite, had to shake hands, had to understand that they were in the same situation, responsible for the same people, and in front of the same juggernaut. Do you see what I mean? And it was part of the nobility of both of those people that they understood that. But they were both dead before they were 40.
And the aspect we haven't discussed of the case throughout Rick's book is the black mother's fear, especially for the male child.
Yeah.
And let me just set this here. A woman I met, Lucille Dickerson, here in Chicago, years ago, met her, and she was describing her fears when her son went to join the march, Montgomery to Selma, and her fears, and then she held up an apron. Mm-hmm. The apron. She held to hold in front of him as though it was her apron, but shielding him with the apron, and to behave and be. And so, throughout this book, of course, we have whenever a child is late during this time, this overwhelming fear, especially of the male, the male.
Black women are. No one has written that story yet. Really, it's beginning to come out finally, but black women. Responsible after all for the father, their father, they watch him, their lover, they watch him, their son, they watch him, and all three are endangered by their countrymen the moment they try to become men. Now this says something enormous about the trouble we are in, and despair is useless and, even criminal. It is a problem, and the problem is it could be resolved if one changed the focus. And if one really did... Look, this country's never been a white country. Never will be, never can be. I've been here for more than 400 years, so this country's not white. I know much more about, in the generality, I know much more about white Americans than they know about me. And there's a reason for that,
Just as you say women know more about men than men know about women.
Yes, that's right. Yes, there's a reason for that. If one could, dealing with the world in which we live, the world is not white either. And what terrifies me in a way is when I listen to my countrymen, and I realize that when they look around the world, what they don't see, when they look at South America, for example, or Africa, what they don't see, or Europe, what they don't see when they look around the world is what they don't see when they look at me. I have caused them. Their willful blindness has endangered their sense of reality. And this is the most terrifying thing of all. It's no longer a Negro problem. It never was, in fact. But it is beginning to be perceptibly a white problem, and specifically in this country, with the dreadful, dreadful, dreadful orchestration coming from South Africa. Because the situation in South Africa implicates the entire Western world, morally and economically, and it engages the great question of the future of this world.
Do you realize you and I are talking, certainly you are talking now, as though this were 24 years ago? As though this were 24 years ago. Now, there have been advances.
There have been changes, there have been details. But from the point of view, not necessarily my point of view, but from the point of view of the boy, the girl in the streets, what are they looking at after all? Let us say there have been even greater changes than there have been. I can't tell a 17-year-old boy or girl, a 25-year-old boy or girl, what it was like to be 25 when I was 25. It doesn't mean anything to them. What they're facing is what they are facing now.
So now we're talking, aren't we, about a gap that's occurred here. There are some who are part of a small, increasing black middle class, some of whom have made it. Mm-hmm. But you're talking about the great many who may find themselves in a tougher situation than was 25 years ago.
Yes, it's exactly
because of the impression
yes.
that advances have been made for them.
Exactly. Which increases the bitterness, and the loss and the suicide rate is mounting and the enrollment rate is dropping. Because they hardly trust me, and they don't find anyone else to trust among their presumably elected representatives.
Well, here is someone on a street corner. He's black and he's 17 and no job at all in store for him. By the way, we do know that whenever there are jobs, I notice often in this very building, it says 50 jobs. There are about 500 kids out there, most black and Hispanic and some poor white. So there is a wanting, you see.
Oh, yeah.
But there are no jobs, so therefore there is energy here. There's animal
That's right.
energy. Now, where's that energy going to go? If it can't go social, it has to go antisocial.
Exactly. It goes into it. It destroys the person. Finally, it destroys the boy, who is really, to put it very brutally, as far as he's concerned, what is he facing? And they told me what they're facing. I'm not making it up. They're facing what? They're facing the army, the needle, or the gun.
So we're talking about reflections, aren't we? Reflections on your covering a certain case
That's right,
in Atlanta.
yes.
Recovering the Wayne Williams case in Atlanta, Georgia. And from that you go on to other matters that are not peripheral at all.
No, not at all. We are concerned, after all, we are concerned with the health of a community, And it is not simply the black community, because the situation of the black community reveals tremendous, reveals everything one needs to know about the white community. We are, whether or not we like it, connected. And what happens to me is really also happening to you.
We know this in the case of drugs, for example. When it first came into light, drugs in the young, we thought, black kids and drugs. We know now it's hit, some time ago has it hit the white suburbs.
Oh yes, it is white suburbs a quarter of a century ago. It was dumped into the ghetto, but it didn't stay in the ghetto. It's like supposing that cholera will remain in Harlem. The plague spreads. And now it's spread throughout the entire Western world, because something else has changed, too. Outside this country. When I went to England, for example, 1948, 1949, it could consider itself a white country, and they still had an empire. The sun never set on it, they said. And the sun can't find it now. But more important than that, the people, for example, who caused the riot in Brussels coming out of Liverpool, if you think back on it, 50 years ago, those people would have been in the colonies civilizing me. And what has happened in the intervening time is not only don't they have any place to go, they can't be shipped out to the colonies anymore. They're in the colonies, they're going to be shipped out too. The colonies are shipping them back home. And they can't leave London or Liverpool. And on top of that, I also left the colonies in them, and I'm on the mainland. So, and this is true of every ex-colonial power. And Amsterdam is now a much darker city than it was 25 years ago. And this is happening all over the Western world. It's happening all over the world. And there is absolutely no way for us, who are the leaders of the Western world, the most crucial country in the West, to possibly ignore or deny or turn back.
Yeah. Well, one of the questions you ask is, what is a nation?
Yes.
What is a nation?
Well, I don't know what it is anymore. I thought I did once. A nation, well, I think the whole idea of nations is undergoing some tremendous change, which I'm not equipped to talk about. No one is equipped really to judge that future, which again, horrifyingly enough, is suggested by what is going on in South Africa. Because obviously that nation, as a white nation, has no future. What comes now, nobody dares imagine. But we have reached a culmination point. We reach a point of no return. And that means whether I like it or not, that my identity is being changed. Yours is being changed. A day may come, I was thinking to myself one day, a day may come and I will look back with longing on the English system, and look back with longing on the American realities which are so menace me today. Even that may come. But in any case, as of this moment, we cannot go back to 1900. We are near the year 2000, and we have to deal with that. And this is true whether or not I say so, whether or not you say so.
Yeah. A question these are what I call comic questions that come
Mm-hmm.
often. The blacks, the trouble they're causing. And then Nelson Ogden, before he asked the question, what would the United States be like if there were no blacks?
Mm-hmm.
What would this country be like?
What would they eat?
if there were
What
no
music
black
would they
people?
listen to? Yes, I know. How would they move?
How would they move? Who built? Starting who built the roads and the ditches? As one old guy, Spencer, on the train to Washington, 16 marches. Millions of us did it for nothing for 400
That's
years,
right.
and then for damn little after that.
Mm-hmm.
And then what about this music called jazz, the original American art form? It's one original art form.
Mm-hmm.
Would there have been that? And then you start thinking,
What would that be?
what would there be? What
Mm-hmm.
would that? What kind of country would this have been?
Well, we're talking about a country built on the backs of slaves, but more importantly than that, the how can I put this? The denied, the malign personality of black people is the key to the American personality, and nobody wants to see that, but it is absolutely true. Americans are as unlike Englishmen or Scots, or they're as unlike Europeans as it's possible to be, and that's because of the black presence here.
Do you know there's something, there's several comments you make here that obviously are very, to put it mildly, piquant, certainly provocative. At the black, it's not so much integration of black, it's desegregation, but
Yes, that's
not
right.
integration.
That's right.
Why don't you expand on that a bit?
What I tried to say in the book, and I tell a story which people who think they're white find difficult to understand, but I do remember I quoted in the book. A black lady in Alabama standing on a porch and looking at me with her arms folded. And she said, white people don't hate black people. If they did, we'd all be black. And that's a that's a kind of, bottom finding a very shocking statement, but it's absolutely true. No black person in his right mind was asking for integration. I have uncles who look like you. We've been integrated since we got here, after the sun goes down. We wanted to be free. It was desegregation. It was be no longer under the necessity of telling my 3-year-old son why he can't use that restroom, or why he can't play in that park, or go to this school, or do whatever, to raise my children to be free, to become whatever they could become, without the tremendous, the castrating definitions of the American Republic. We were after that, and we are still after that. And what people do not see is that the black freedom in this country is the only hope of white freedom. I am your only hope of freedom.
It's so often, Virginia Durr, a southern white woman, one of the early ones they call premature integrationists, was saying, whenever a southern white is in trouble and grieving very much for loss, the first person he, very often she, runs to is the black person.
That's right. We have the testimony from Faulkner, we have the testimony from Carson McCullers, from countless others. And the Member of the Wedding is about that.
Member of the Wedding, of course, little Frankie, and there was Bernice.
That's right.
And there
Who
is...
held up her universe.
Now this part is the most provocative. This is Baldwin in The Evidence Things Not Seen. Up until and during that betrayed and co-opted insurrection, that American folklore is trivialized into the civil rights movement. The porter and the banker and the dentist all knew they needed each other. And you speak of you implying that is the condition, the problem, the dilemma was trivialized into the civil rights. Would you mind explaining that?
And Malcolm X asks a very important question during the time of a sit-in student, a radio program that I moderated. And he asked the kid a very important question. He said, why are you fighting for your civil rights? If you're a citizen, you have your civil rights. That question's never been answered in my own mind as the struggle wore on. It seemed to me it was not, of course, it was the civil rights were what we were after. But this demand was being came about, not from the top or from the bottom. It was a black impulse to freedom, and in that sense, it was more accurately described, as I put it to myself later, a slave insurrection. It was an attempt to define oneself outside the crippling boundaries of the Republic's definitions, above all for one's children. It was that. And that is how we began, after all. And it's by no means accidental that it was led by preachers. The preacher, as I say in the book again, was our first witness. He was the one who told us that we were all equal in the sight of God, when our masters were assuring us that God had made us but not in his image. He was the one who told us that freedom was possible, freedom was real, that freedom was our responsibility, that we had, at whatever price, to set ourselves and our children free. And that is still so. And it is still the aspiration of black people which most terrifies the Republic. The great question is why? Because if that is so, and we know that it is so, that means that countless numbers of white people are living here in chains. That is what it means.
So the overdog, or the one who thinks he's an overdog, is pretty much is in worse shape than the underdog.
He's a slave to his illusions. He's a slave to his idea of safety, and never can grow up. And that is terrifying.
And so we end this conversation as we began. The book is James Baldwin, The Evidence of Things Not Seen, published by Holt Reinhardt and Winston. It is ostensibly, and it is about Wayne Williams and the child murder case in Atlanta, that apparently an attempt being to reopen the case. But it's become a catapult, a diving board for James Baldwin to take off and reflect on the condition itself. And at the very beginning, you said you carry the stereotype with you, sense of shame of those things when you left this country way back in Switzerland working on the book Another Country. So you've changed, but your question is, unfortunately, the country has not changed quite in that same way.
Not in that same way, no. Not in that same way. On the other hand, I tell you, my friend, when I was younger, I was much more impatient than I am now. I'm not reconciled now. But I do see... You see, change is inevitable. It's got to happen anyway. There's nothing anyone can do about it. One finds oneself in the paradoxical position of battling for the freedom of white people. Because white people are clinging to myths which they know are not real. They know the Gone with the Wind is not true. They know it. They know that what they're watching television has a very, very faint relation to reality. They know that. And they are afraid to deal with what every black person in this country has got to deal with 24 hours of every day, and that's reality.
So to help
when reality is all that can change you.
Yeah. So to help free the white from a not-so-grand illusion, from an illusion, obviously, which is, of course, a form of slavery.
That's right.
And so that's what we're talking about. And perhaps we should just hear Bessie Smith, who was about the freest of singers. Just as you heard her then, she helped free you.
That's right,
Bessie Smith, and we'll use a phrase you used 24 years ago, we'll pray for rain.
Yes, indeed. Let's pray for rain.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Studs.
James Baldwin.
Next week on the Studs Terkel Almanac, Studs will have as his guest Barry Lopez, author of Arctic Dreams, Imagination and Desire in a Northern Landscape. The Almanac is a weekly program produced by WFMT Chicago, featuring the best of Studs' daily interviews, short story readings, documentaries, music programs, and whatever Studs feels will be of interest to his listeners. Now, this is Rich Warren, hoping you've enjoyed today's program and that you'll join us again next week for the Studs Terkel Almanac. The Almanac is coming to you on the WFMT Fine Arts Network.